Chapter 43-47. At this time, Ji Tianqing did not care about any poise or Kenshin's prestige anymore. He was also not foolish enough to say a few harsh words to Pan Ruo and the rest before fleeing far away. After teleporting 10,000 miles, he did not stop at all and continued to teleport east. As for Pan Ruo, the two marshals and several divine generals, after the initial astonishment, they all came back to their senses and immediately teleported in pursuit. Whoosh, whoosh whoosh. Following streaks of white light, bursts of ear-piercing sounds came out. Over 100 divine kings teleported away to pursue Ji Tianqing. Over 20,000 soldiers also maintained their formation and gave chase in a grandiose manner. Of course, for Pan Ruo to be able to predict that Ji Tianqing would come to Heavenly Sword Mountain and set up an ambush here in advance, she definitely had more tricks up her sleeves. Her speed was the fastest, chasing after Ji Tianqing 10,000 miles in a step. At the same time, she released several jade slips. Swish, swish. The jade slips streaked across the sky and disappeared into the horizon. Very soon, in the mountains tens of thousands of miles away, divine light lit up and rapidly formed an enormous canopy. A giant barrier that was 200,000 miles long sealed off the route to the east and south of Heavenly Sword Mountain. Furthermore, there were also over a dozen divine king experts who were lying in ambush here guarding the grand array, flying out from the mountains. When Ji Tianqing teleported over at lightning speed, those dozen divine kings all waved their divine weapons and pounced forward without regard for their own safety, releasing their most ferocious attacks. No matter how powerful Ji Tianqing's strength was, he also could not ignore those divine kings and allow the divine light that filled the sky to land on his body. He could only brandish the Burial of Heaven sword and use Sword Dao divine abilities, splashing out sword lights that filled the sky, launching a counterattack. Bam bam. Bam bam bam. The divine arts that the dozen divine kings cast were all shattered by Ji Tianqing's sword lights, scattering in the sky. He brandished over a dozen sword lights again and repelled those dozen divine kings, splattering blood all over the sky. After carving out a bloody path, the front was still blocked by the divine light barrier. Furthermore, there was a formless energy binding him, suppressing his strength. Even though his strength was powerful enough and was not suppressed by the array formation's power. However, in the end they still wasted 2 breaths of time. At this time Hanya was the first to arrive, catching up. Long Tian, take this. Pan Ruo was still thousands of miles away, but she had already shouted out those 4 words. She brandished her 2 swords and pierced out a long rainbow that filled the sky. Carrying a trace of the power of the Way of the Heavens, she locked onto Ji Tianqing. Even if she was aggressive and murderous. However, based on this small detail, Ji Tianqing was able to guess that in her heart, she still couldn't bear to kill him. If someone really wanted to kill him, how could they possibly shout out words like, "Watch out, take this," in advance? Heavenly Dragon Palm. Daylight Sword. Pan Ruo's incarnation was far stronger than a peak divine king. It had 50% of the original body's strength. Ji Tianqing did not dare to be careless. He could only cast a spell to meet the attack. His left hand struck out a heavenly dragon palm shadow, while his right hand thrust out a light spot with his sword. That spot of light expanded rapidly, instantly turning into a dazzling sun, blocking Pan Ruo's rainbow that filled the sky. Bam, bam, bam. A series of muffled sounds rang out. Pan Ruo's divine sword technique was instantly blocked and defeated. On the other hand, Ji Tianqing's heavenly dragon palm broke through her sword light's blockade and hit her with a loud bang. Bam. With a muffled sound, Pan Ruo was sent flying back, rolling and smashing into a distant mountain peak. Fortunately, she had divine light protecting her body and a supreme-grade divine artifact protecting her, so she was not heavily injured. Ji Tianqing's palm only sent her flying. Her divine power was shaken, and her movements were temporarily affected. Reality proved that Pan Ruo's incarnation was not Ji Tianqing's match at all. After all, she had received Kenshin's guidance and teachings back then, which was why she was able to break through to peak divine king. Even after she became the God Emperor and created her own divine skills and cultivation techniques, she still left behind a lot of Kenshin's shadow. Especially her Sword Dao divine ability. No matter how it changed, it could not escape the scope of Kenshin's teachings back then. It could not be helped. Looking at the world's Sword Dao, Kenshin alone owned 90%. Ji Tianqing repelled Pan Ruo with one move, But he did not take advantage of the victory to pursue. Instead, he turned and swung his sword at the divine light barrier. He used his divine eye technique to observe the veins of the divine light barrier, looking for the array foundation and nodes in order to break it open as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the dozen or so injured divine kings pounced over without any regard for their own safety and began to surround him. Those 12 divine kings all had the strength of level 6 or level 7. Although it was very difficult for them to cause any substantial damage to Ji Tianxing, they could still create some trouble for Ji Tianxing. Of course, it was just a little trouble. Heaven-piercing sword. Ji Tianxing was unwilling to tangle with them, so he could only kill them. His left hand struck out with the primordial chaos bell, while his right hand used a sword Dao divine ability. Bam! With a loud sound, several divine kings were smashed into meat paste by the divine bell, blood splattering everywhere. The bodies of those divine kings were destroyed, and only their godheads flew out, fleeing into the distance in a daze. As for the heaven-piercing sword, it slashed 3 divine kings, and their fates were even more miserable. The 3 of them were cut in half by the sword light. Not only were their bodies destroyed, even their godheads were shattered into pieces and they died on the spot. The other divine kings were stunned and they did not dare to attack again. They quickly retreated into the distance. However, their mission was completed and they had bought enough time. Pan Ruo teleported over again, waving her 2 swords, and used a new divine ability that she created, attacking Ji Tianxing fiercely. Ji Tianxing braced himself to deal with her attacks, dissolving her moves one by one. Immediately after, the 2 marshals under Pan Ruo, and a few divine generals of the 8th heaven of the divine king realm also arrived. Without saying a word, they waved their divine weapons and joined the battle, assisting Pan Ruo in attacking Ji Tianxing. In the beginning, when Ji Tianxing fought Pan Ruo, he only needed to use 70% of his power to deal with her easily. When 10 experts surrounded him, the pressure on him increased greatly, and he could only use 100% of his power to defeat and injure those marshals and divine generals. As time passed, the 30 over high-level divine kings and 60 over mid-level divine kings also arrived one after another. As a result, the situation was somewhat out of control. Under Pan Ruo's lead, more than 100 divine king experts surrounded Ji Tianxing. Even if he had 3 heads and 6 arms and had extraordinary abilities, he could not use them and it was impossible for him to escape. However, Ji Tianxing did not only have 3 heads and 6 arms. He could have 10 heads and 20 arms. Absolute shadows of 10 directions. Following Ji Tianxing's cold shout, 9 doppelgangers appeared around him. Each doppelganger had 50% of his power, and all of them were holding high-level divine swords and divine weapons, and wearing high-level divine armors. After all, in Ji Tianxing's spatial ring, there were tens of thousands of divine weapons and among them, there were close to 1,000 high-level divine weapons. His original body was fighting Pan Ruo, the 2 marshals and the 7 divine generals, and he still had the upper hand. As for his 9 doppelgangers, they were all spread out fighting alone. Each doppelganger could deal with 3 to 4 high-level divine kings, and 7 to 8 mid-level divine kings. As a result, even if there were more than 100 divine king experts, it would be difficult to defeat him. The situation of the battle instantly became delicate. Chapter 43-48. Pan Ruo and the hundreds of godly king experts under her command were all stopped by Ji Tianxing and his 9 avatars. The 2 sides fought for a while and the situation was in a stalemate. It was difficult to determine the victor. It was also because Ji Tianxing still had some leeway and kept some trump cards. Otherwise, he would definitely have the upper hand and quickly kill those godly kings. On the surface, the 2 sides were fighting fiercely and were evenly matched. To determine the victor, they only needed to wait for the 20,000 elite experts to arrive and besiege Ji Tianxing. In just 10 breaths of time, more than 20,000 soldiers had arrived at the battlefield in a grandiose manner. They immediately spread out and formed an encirclement to deal with Ji Tianxing together. Although they were weak and could not cause any harm to Ji Tianxing at all by themselves, they could form an array to form an array. However, they could join forces to form a battle formation and release destructive attacks. They could also use the formation to suppress Ji Tianxing and suppress his strength. All in all, once these 20,000 soldiers joined the battle, Ji Tianxing would definitely be defeated. However, he was already prepared for this. Before the 20,000 soldiers could complete the encirclement, he attacked first. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing opened the exit of the god-slaying battleship and also shot out the Jutian 10 Absolutes pagoda. Following flashes of white light, the 15 followers led by Nangong Ao rushed out of the god-slaying battleship. Bai Long also drove the god-slaying battleship and did not hesitate to use a huge amount of cultivation resources to activate the divine array and divine cannons, locking onto the 20,000 soldiers. Ji Ke controlled the Jutian 10 Absolutes pagoda and opened the exit. Yun Yao led Ji Wuhan, Ji Wushuang, Bai Feng, Chao Qingyu, Lin Shui and the others out of the pagoda. In the blink of an eye, more than 30 godly king experts appeared on the battlefield. Moreover, each godly king expert was armed with a king-grade high-quality divine artifact, and their equipment was extremely luxurious and powerful. Especially Ji Ku, who had 2 supreme-grade divine artifacts, the Jutian 10 Absolutes pagoda and the Heavenly Star Chain. As long as she did not face Pan Ruo's avatar, she was invincible. Ji Tianxing had already instructed everyone to ignore Pan Ruo and the 100 over divine kings and to not help him. Their mission was to intercept and kill the 20,000 soldiers as much as possible. Over 30 divine king experts against over 20,000 elite divine monarchs. No matter how one looked at it, it was absurd and impossible. However, these people were controlling the god-slaying battleship, the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda, and the Heavenly Star Chain. They had the support of 3 top-grade king-grade divine artifacts and the protection of countless king-grade high-grade divine artifacts. In addition, every god king that could follow Ji Tianxing was a genius with extraordinary talent. Their battle prowess far surpassed other god kings of the same realm. Therefore they were not afraid at all. They quickly joined the battle in an orderly manner. They used all kinds of divine abilities and secret techniques to kill more than 20,000 elites or gods. Swish, swish, boom 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 boom. All kinds of powerful and delicate techniques poured down like a torrential flood, drowning more than 20,000 soldiers. Accompanied by earth-shattering noises and explosions, a large amount of blood splattered in the crowd. Countless pieces of flesh and blood splattered everywhere. The god-slaying battleship's performance was the most shocking. 400 divine cannons attacked at the same time, releasing pillars of fire and lightning that filled the sky. They continuously bombarded the crowd. The mountains and land within a radius of 10,000 miles were blasted into scorched ruins by a few thousand pillars of light in a breath's time. In just one exchange, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others had slaughtered more than 3,000 divine monarchs. This not only caused great casualties to the enemy, but also successfully intimidated everyone. It caused the morale of the soldiers to plummet, and they became fearful of the slightest thing. However, this was only the first round of confrontation between the two sides. The appearance of Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others was really unexpected. That was why the soldiers were caught off guard. When the 20,000 soldiers reacted, they quickly formed a battle formation and used all their strength to defend and counterattack. In this way it was very difficult for Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others to achieve such dazzling results. On the other side, Pan Ruo, the 2 marshals and the many god generals who were besieging Ji Tianxing were all stunned by the scene before them. They originally thought that Ji Tianxing would only bring Bai Long with him. They did not expect that Ji Tianxing would summon so many god king experts with a wave of his hand. Those 30 god kings were all armed to the teeth. They possessed extremely high-end and powerful divine artifacts. Furthermore, each god king had strength that surpassed those of the same realm. Their combat strength was extremely formidable. Just those 30 god kings, together with a battleship and a divine pagoda, were able to stop more than 20,000 soldiers. This was simply too shocking. Of course, this was the thought of the 2 marshals, the many god generals and the many god king experts. Pan Ruo's thoughts were far more complicated than theirs. Other than being shocked by the 30 god king experts following Kenshin, she was more concerned about the few women and the cold youth in the crowd. Not to mention the peerlessly beautiful Yun Yao and Ji Ku. Just Lin Shui and Zhen Hong were both rarely seen beauties with special temperaments. As for the equally beautiful Lana, Pan Ruo could see that she did not seem to have much relationship with Kenshin. She was the companion of another middle-aged man in a green robe. Pan Ruo only took 2 glances and determined that Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Lin Shui and Zhen Hong were all Kenshin's confidants. Then her attention fell on Ji Wuhan and Ji Wushuang. It was because these 2 siblings' appearances and temperaments were simply too handsome and special. Needless to say, Ji Wuhan was 80% similar to his father. He was extremely handsome and his temperament was silent and cold. He was very much like Kenshin back then. Although Ji Wushuang looked like a 14 or 15-year-old girl, she was also devastatingly beautiful. She was very similar to her mother Yunyao. Her eyes and brows were also very similar to her father Ji Tianxing. Just based on their appearances and temperaments, Pan Ruo could conclude that they were definitely Kenshin's sons and daughters. Instantly, Pan Ruo froze on the spot as if she had been struck by lightning. She was somewhat dazed as if she had been severely injured. She stared at Yunyao, Jiku, Ji Wuhan, Ji Wushuang and the others. Her eyes were somewhat blurred, and her mind was somewhat absent-minded. In her heart and mind, there were only silent questions and angry roars. They are all Long Tian's confidants? Those two young men and young women are actually his children? Why is it like this? Long Tian was reborn and even Mingyu came back from the dead? Isn't he cold and heartless and doesn't talk about relationships? Why did he marry Mingyu and those three women? He would rather take on 4 Dao companions than give this emperor a chance. Back then he heartlessly rejected this emperor. Why exactly was that? Although Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others were all devastatingly beautiful, Pan Ruo didn't think that she was inferior to them at all. She even thought that she was the most special and the most outstanding woman in the world. Mingyu and those 3 women added together couldn't compare to her. However, Kenshin would rather have 4 Dao companions than treat her coldly and without pity. How could this be? Chapter 43-49. Pan Ruo was the only female god emperor in the world. At the same time she was also the strongest woman in the world. She believed that she was peerless and irreplaceable, and that no other woman could be compared to her. But she just couldn't understand why her beloved Kenshin would rather marry 4 vulgar women than live together with her. Why was that? What was so bad about her? That despicable man, back then he said that he was infatuated with the way of the sword and the way of the gods, and didn't want to talk about relationships. Looking at it now, it was all a lie. If he didn't want to talk about relationships, how could he marry 4 wives? Bah! Hypocritical scum. Pan Ruo, who had complicated feelings after the shock, astonishment and confusion, was filled with endless anger. This time all the feelings she had for Kenshin as well as the last trace of hope hidden in the bottom of her heart were also destroyed. She was burning with anger, her gaze was like a sword as she stared at Ji Tianxing with murderous intent and angrily shouted, "Long Tian! You despicable, shameless, hypocritical bastard! This emperor had always thought that you were the most outstanding man in the world and were different from everyone else. Looking at it now, this emperor was wrong about you. You who had exposed your true nature are actually so ugly and disgusting. This emperor will definitely kill you today." Pan Ruo cursed with a fierce tone and no longer held back as she waved her 2 swords without any regard for her own safety, and launched a fierce attack on Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing was a little stunned as he frowned at Pan Ruo and was very confused. Before this, wasn't the atmosphere always strange with a little bit of resentment and a little bit of affection and conflict? Why did the atmosphere suddenly change? The beautiful woman that he loved and hated and had a trace of resentment in her heart suddenly turned into a vicious demoness? Despicable and shameless? Hypocritical to the extreme? Extremely ugly and nauseating? Are you talking about me? What did I do? How is it despicable, shameless and disgusting? Ji Tianxing felt that he had been wronged and was also baffled. However, Pan Ruo attacked like crazy, so he naturally wouldn't hold back and also counterattacked with all his strength. The all-out battle between the 2 peerless powerhouses created a destructive shockwave that spread out in all directions. Those Divine King powerhouses in the surroundings immediately suffered a calamity, being affected very badly. Those high-level Divine Kings were still fine. Relying on various defensive methods, they only suffered some light injuries and were blasted far away. And those middle-level Divine Kings, their fates were very miserable. Ji Tianxing and Hanya's battle had swept over them. Even if they didn't die, they were still heavily injured. Many of them had terrible scars and broken limbs. As the battle between the 2 became more and more intense, more and more people around them suffered. Even a few divine generals were heavily injured and retreated with blood all over their bodies. Only 2 marshals and 3 deity generals continued to grit their teeth and persevere, assisting Hanya to besiege Ji Tianxing. After fighting for a while, the surroundings became much more spacious and no one dared to approach. Pan Ruo also wanted to shift the battlefield, bringing Ji Tianqing into the distance, away from the god kings under her command. Along with the passage of time, Pan Ruo's strength was severely depleted, and her injuries also continuously worsened. The 2 marshals and 3 deity generals were also covered in wounds, their strength weakening. Ji Tianqing gained the upper hand and took the time to question Pan Ruo. What did those words mean previously? On what basis did she scold him as despicable, shameless, and unbearably ugly? But Pan Ruo disdained to explain. Towards his questioning, she just snorted disdainfully and said, "Scoundrel! Shameless! Go to hell." Every time Ji Tianqing questioned her, she would always say these 2 words of truth. Ji Tianqing felt rather tired in his heart and did not harp on this question anymore. He unleashed all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate skills with all his strength, increasing the pace of his attacks. Unknowingly, an hour passed. After the battle between the 2 sides passed through the most intense stage, it gradually came to an end. At this time, Ji Tianqing's 9 clones all suffered some light injuries, their strength mostly depleted. However, more than 60 of the 100 godly monarch experts were killed by his 9 clones. The remaining 30 or so godly monarchs that were still alive were all either lightly or heavily injured, their battle prowess greatly reduced. As for Ji Tianqing, he had already killed 3 deity generals, severely injured 2 marshals, and severely injured Pan Ruo's incarnation. In the battle of experts, Ji Tianqing had obtained an absolute advantage. Victory was only a matter of time. But on the other side, Yunyao, Jiku, Baifeng, and the others were engaged in a battle with more than 20,000 soldiers. The situation was not optimistic. Although Yunyao, Jiku, and the others had the upper hand at the beginning with their super strength and supreme-grade divine artifacts, they had slaughtered many godly monarch experts. But as time passed, after they had killed more than 10,000 godly monarchs, they had exhausted too much of their strength, and their strength had begun to weaken. The 16,000 godly monarch realm soldiers that were lucky enough to survive also gradually calmed down from their initial shock. They stabilized their footing and formed a battle formation. They responded in an orderly manner, using all their strength to resist and defend. As a result, it became harder and harder for Yunyao, Jiku, and the others' attacks to achieve any results. As matters stood, the 30 or so godly monarchs' strength had decreased greatly, their strength had become weaker and weaker. It was already very difficult for them to kill those godly monarch realm soldiers. After the 16,000 soldiers stabilized the battle situation, they began to counterattack in an orderly manner, gradually gaining the upper hand. As for Yunyao, Jiku, and the others, they could only rely on the 2 supreme-grade divine artifacts, the God-slaying battleship and the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda, to resolve the siege of more than 10,000 soldiers and remain undefeated. They had already entered a stalemate and were unable to break through. They could only place their hopes on Ji Tianqing. On the battlefield 50,000 miles away, Ji Tianqing had also noticed the situation. He unleashed his potential without caring about anything else and increased the pace of his attacks. Pan Ruo felt immense pressure and was forced to retreat by him. Her injuries were becoming more and more severe. However, she was very stubborn. She did not let out any sounds of pain or grunting. She used all her strength to resist and resolve the attacks. The 2 marshals' injuries were very serious. They should not continue fighting. They should retreat as soon as possible and recuperate. However, they saw that Pan Ruo was fighting to the death, so they could not retreat in advance. As a result, they could only continue fighting and persuade Pan Ruo to retreat as soon as possible. Now that the battle situation had reached such a stage, it could be said that they had lost their momentum and could not be salvaged. Stopping their losses in time and returning to the chaotic paradise to recuperate and gather their forces for the next battle was the right move. However, Pan Ruo did not listen to their advice and insisted on not retreating. She would rather die in battle than to perish together with Kenshin. Of course, this could only be a fantasy and a goal that was difficult to achieve. After the 2 sides fought for another 15 minutes, Pan Ruo was so heavily injured that she could not continue fighting. The 2 marshals were also killed by Ji Tianqing and died on the spot. Not far away, Ji Tianqing's 9 clones had also killed more than 30 godly monarchs. Of course, every single clone suffered serious injuries, flickering with flickering divine radiance. Now that the situation had reached such a stage, Pan Ruo finally stopped fighting and confronted Ji Tianqing high in the sky. Chapter 4350. Strong winds howled in the sky. Not far away the battle was still going on and loud rumbling sounds could be heard. However, Pan Ruo endured her injuries and stared coldly at Ji Tianxing. Her anger and hatred had not dissipated. Pan Ruo, although your plan was very successful and the plan was executed perfectly. But unfortunately you've lost again. Ji Tianxing looked at her calmly and said in an indifferent tone. Pan Ruo was already very angry, and when she heard the word again, she became even more furious. She could not help but scold, "Bastard. I only lost to you once and this is the second time. But don't forget you also lost to me once and you even lost your life." It was probably because Ji Tianxing's word, again, that made her remember the first time they met, which was why she was so angry. Ji Tianxing did not care and continued, "Before the battle I already said that no matter how perfect your plan was, have you ever thought of the consequences of failure? Previously I told you to leave with your trusted soldiers and belongings, and hand over the primal chaos continent to me, but you did not listen. Now the outcome is still the same, but the price you have to pay is a bit too big." Pan Ruo's gaze was cold and she glared at him with hatred. She shouted angrily, "You heartless bastard, you still want to kill me?" Ji Tianxing nodded and persuaded, "Don't be so agitated, you are only an avatar. Even if I destroy it, your original body will not be affected much. To be safe I have to destroy this avatar of yours, you understand?" Hearing this, Pan Ruo looked at the distant battlefield at Yunyao, Jiku and the others. She understood that Kenshin wanted to protect his family and friends from her revenge and assassination. This also meant that in Kenshin's heart, she was not as important as his family and subordinates. He. Pan Ruo laughed coldly at herself and roared in a low voice, "What a heartless and shameless person. Long Tian, I hate you." After saying that, she did not hesitate to self-destruct. She wanted to destroy this incarnation and kill Ji Tianxing. Even if she couldn't kill Ji Tianxing with her, she could at least seriously injure him. In this way he would be able to teach Ji Tianxing a tragic lesson and delay his progress in subduing the primal chaos continent. Buzz. In the next moment, Pan Ruo's entire body lit up with 5-colored divine light, burning with dark red blood flames, and a wisp of Daoist rime appeared above her head. Her avatar expanded violently, becoming translucent and translucent. A terrifying destructive force was brewing and accumulating, ready to explode at any moment. Pan Ruo's incarnation was above the divine king realm, half a god emperor's strength. Once she self-destructed, everything within a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles would be destroyed. Even space would collapse and turn into the void. Not only would the 10,000 soldiers under her command disappear without a trace, but they would also be reduced to ashes. Even Yunyao, Jiku and the others would be killed on the spot. Pan Ruo's hatred for Kenshin was manifested at this moment. She would rather self-destruct her avatar and kill the 10,000 soldiers under her command to severely injure Kenshin and kill Kenshin's friends and subordinates. Of course, Ji Tianxing had thought of this as well. He had anticipated the severity of the consequences. So when Pan Ruo self-destructed, he didn't have time to stop her. He had to rush forward and try his best to resist the power of the self-destruction. Divine Bell. Rise. Ji Tianxing recklessly activated his divine power and unleashed the strongest power he had ever unleashed in his life, pouring it into the primordial chaos bell. Buzz. The divine bell flashed with 7-colored divine light and expanded to a radius of 1,000 miles, enveloping Pan Ruo in an instant. Before he could cast a divine art and activate the divine bell to unleash more power, Pan Ruo had already self-destructed. Boom! There was an earth-shattering explosion inside the primal chaos bell, as if billions of thunderbolts had exploded at the same time. The power of Pan Ruo's self-destruction was so powerful that it couldn't be described with words. The top-grade king-level primal chaos bell's internal structure was instantly destroyed, and dense cracks appeared on its surface. The divine bell was blasted tens of thousands of miles away by the terrifying explosion and smashed into the divine light barrier in the distance. So the divine light barrier that Pan Ruo had set up in advance to stop Ji Tianxing was also smashed into pieces. When the 1,000-mile divine bell fell to the ground, it rolled for another few thousand miles before gradually coming to a stop. Wherever the divine clock passed by, mountains, rivers, and earth would fall apart, turning into ruins and deep pits. The divine bell that was buried underground also became dim, full of cracks, and lost its divine power. It was like a pile of scrap metal. Of course. When dozens of cracks appeared on the primal chaos bell, it couldn't help but emit terrifying divine light shockwaves that spread in all directions. The explosion of the divine bell had already caused Ji Tianqing to suffer from the shock and backlash. He was immediately severely injured and blood spurted out of his 7 orifices. Then he was swept away by the divine light shockwaves that burst out from the cracks. He couldn't help but be sent flying tens of thousands of miles away. The violent divine light shockwaves also swept across the god-slaying battleship that was tens of thousands of miles away, covering Yunyao, Jiku and the 10,000 divine monarch realm soldiers. The result was very tragic. Yunyao, Jiku and the 30 divine monarch realm experts were able to resist the divine light shockwaves under the protection of the god-slaying battleship and 9 Heavens Tenju Pagoda. Only some of them suffered light injuries. However, the 10,000 divine monarch realm soldiers were very unlucky. More than half of them were killed on the spot. The other 5,000 soldiers were also severely injured. Blood splattered everywhere and broken limbs flew all over the sky. The surviving soldiers no longer had the ability to fight and collapsed on the spot. Some were seriously injured and unconscious and fell into the ruins unable to move. Some were riddled with wounds. When they saw that Pan Ruo God Emperor and the commanders were all dead, they fled in panic. In short, this great battle ended with Pan Ruo's side suffering a crushing defeat. Yunyao, Jiku and the others who had dodged the divine light shockwaves hurriedly flew out of the god-slaying battleship and god-slaying pagoda after the shockwaves dissipated. They rushed to the ruins that were tens of thousands of miles away to check on Ji Tianqing's situation. Just now, they saw with their own eyes that Ji Tianqing used the god-slaying divine bell to suppress Pan Ruo's self-destruction. However, he was shaken to the point that blood spurted out of his 7 orifices, and he fell tens of thousands of miles away. Everyone was filled with worry and anxiety. They were afraid that something would happen to Ji Tianqing. Fortunately, when they flew near the ruins, they saw Ji Tianqing in ragged clothes and disheveled hair flying out of the ruins. Although he looked very miserable, covered in blood and mud and staggered a little, his internal injuries were not serious. However, it was only his internal injuries that were too severe. His divine body didn't suffer too much damage. Seeing that he could still move and cast spells, Yunyao, Jiku and the others finally relaxed. Therefore, Yunyao decisively ordered a dozen or so followers by Feng, Chao Qingyu and the others, to chase after the heavily injured soldiers who had fled. Shi Jiku, Ji Wuhan, Ji Wushuang, and the others hurriedly went to check on Ji Tianqing's injuries. Chapter 43-51. Tianqing, how are your injuries? Big brother Tianqing, are your injuries serious? Yunyao, Jiku and the others flew to Ji Tianqing's side. They supported him on both sides and asked about his injuries with concern. Ji Wuhan and Ji Wushuang's faces were also filled with worry. They looked at Ji Tianqing with concern. Ji Tianqing coughed twice and spat out a mouthful of dirty blood. He circulated his energy to clean up the blood and dirt on his body and smiled at his family. He waved his hand and said, "Don't worry. It's just that the god clock was destroyed and I suffered a backlash. It's nothing serious. I'll be fine after recuperating for a while." Yunyao and Jiku hurriedly used their divine techniques to check on Ji Tianqing's injuries. They were only relieved when they confirmed that there were no major problems. Then the family simply treated their injuries. Ji Tianqing let Yunyao and Jiku take the 2 children back to the distorted spacetime to recuperate. He began to clean up the battlefield and collect the interspatial rings and godhead fragments of the god kings. It was a pity that the interspatial rings couldn't withstand the self-destruction of Pan Ruo's god emperor's incarnation and also collapsed. In addition, Pan Ruo's incarnation was condensed from divine energy and refined from a special divine item. It didn't have a godhead. Therefore, Ji Tianqing's harvest was limited to the interspatial rings and godhead fragments of the 100 god kings. After he spent half an hour collecting the spoils of war, Bai Feng, Chao Qingyu, and the others also completed their mission and returned with the spoils of war. 30 god kings chased after the thousands of heavily injured god monarchs. They chased them for tens of thousands of miles and successfully killed all the soldiers. When they returned to the battlefield, they saw more than 2,000 heavily injured and unconscious soldiers lying in the ruins. They were also unable to move. Therefore, without Ji Tianqing's orders, they took the initiative to kill those soldiers. In this way, the 30,000 soldiers and 100 god kings that Pan Ruo had mobilized for this operation were all wiped out. Even though Bai Feng, Nan Gongao and the others were all injured, No one was sacrificed and no one's divine body was destroyed. Compared to the fate of Hanya's subordinates, this was simply a complete victory, a victory that was hard to believe. Everyone handed over their spoils of war to Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing accepted it for the time being. After praising and encouraging everyone, he allowed them to enter the warship in the distorted spacetime to heal their injuries. During this process, he saw that Nangong Nihuang's injuries were very serious. In particular, there were several kinds of violent divine power remaining in her divine body, which were eroding her meridians and divine blood. Those rare divine powers were extremely toxic and corrosive. If he didn't clean it up and get rid of it in time, it would probably affect his foundation in the divine Tao and cause his strength to regress. Among the many followers, Nangong Nihuang was currently the weakest, so it was not strange that her injuries were more serious than the others. But she endured the pain, gritted her teeth and silently returned to the battleship to heal herself. Ji Tianxing frowned. He wanted to call out to her but he hesitated. After everyone returned to the warship and the distorted space-time, Ji Tianxing let Bai Long drive the warship away from the ruins. Next, Bai Long drove the god-slaying warship to find a hidden place to wait for everyone to heal. In any case, Hanya, the 2 marshals and 30,000 soldiers had been killed. The news would spread very quickly. At that time, the entire Primal Chaos continent would be shocked. The other half of Hanya's subordinates would definitely guard the Primal Chaos Grotto Heaven and would not dare to take the initiative to attack. And when the news spread, those forces and experts who were loyal to Kenshin would most likely surface and try to contact Kenshin. In short, Ji Tianxing had just arrived at the Primal Chaos continent. Before he could even show himself, he had already fought a decisive battle with Hanya and obtained a complete victory. With Hanya and 30,000 soldiers killed, the Primal Chaos continent's momentum was gone. The defeat was set. This war had just begun, but it could already be declared over. The god-slaying warship hid its tracks and aura, flew 15 million miles, and hid in a desolate mountain. There were few people in the surrounding million miles and this place was filled with danger. The god-slaying warship was hidden here. He was not afraid of its whereabouts being exposed or being disturbed. The warship hid under a mountain and restrained its aura, as if it had fallen into a deep sleep. Everyone was in seclusion to heal their injuries. Only Ji Tianxing sat in the distorted space-time, silently counting the spoils of war and storing them. In 2 days he had finished counting all the spoils of war. Then he left behind the divine spark fragments and a small number of divine items to slowly refine and study in the future. 90% of the cultivation resources and divine artifacts were stored by him alone. After everyone finished recuperating, he would distribute the resources and equipment to everyone as a reward. Ji Tianxing closed his eyes and thought silently for a moment. Thinking of Nangong Nihuang's injuries and what Ji Ku and Yun Yao had said, he hesitated. After deliberating for a moment, he decided not to go into seclusion to heal his injuries for the time being. He would visit Nangong Nihuang first. After making up his mind, he left the distorted space-time and appeared in the secret room of the god-slaying warship. The entire warship was quiet and the lights were very dim. It was as if everyone was in a deep sleep. Ji Tianxing walked through the corridor unhurriedly and arrived at the door of the innermost room. He used a voice transmission technique to call the person inside. A moment later, the door opened and a beautiful figure appeared in front of him. The person who opened the door was Nangong Nihuang. At this moment she was not wearing a brocade dress or gorgeous hair accessories like before. She was also not wearing armor and looking valiant. She was wearing loose and comfortable clothes, and her long hair was only tied up with a hairband and tied into a simple bun. Her face was a little pale and there were some sweat stains on her forehead. She was clearly tortured by her injuries and her spirit was a little weak. Seeing that the person outside the door was Ji Tianxing, she was stunned for a moment. She hurriedly closed the door and turned to change into formal clothes. Even if she was seriously injured and no matter how absent-minded she did not want Ji Tianxing to see her in such a sorry and haggard state. No matter what, she always wanted to show her best side in front of him. However, Ji Tianxing was a little tactless. He opened the door and entered, not intending to give her time to change. Seeing that he had followed her into the room, Nangong Nihuang was a little nervous and uneasy, but she said calmly, "Long Tian, sit here for a while. I'll change my clothes before coming out." When there were others present, she was used to calling Ji Tianxing Lord Kenshin. and only when the two of them were present would she call him by his name. Ji Tianxing raised his hand to stop her and said gently, "You're so badly injured. Let's deal with your injuries first. At this time, you don't have to care too much about your clothes." Chapter 43-52. Ji Tianxing's words made Nangong Nihuang startled for a moment. She didn't expect that Ji Tianxing would pay attention to her among so many injured people. Originally, she thought that she might stay by Kenshin's side in obscurity. She needed to silently contribute, and only after a long time would she be able to attract his attention and care. She didn't expect that happiness would come so suddenly. A warm current flowed through Nangong Nihuang's heart. She was also a little nervous and her heartbeat accelerated. She lowered her head and didn't speak. If Ji Tianxing didn't speak, the atmosphere in the room would become a little strange. So Ji Tianxing took the initiative to say, "Let's go to the secret room. I'll help you take a look at your injuries first." Nangong Nihuang's heart skipped a beat for no reason, but she didn't say anything. She just lowered her head and pretended to be calm as she nodded. Then she led the way and led Ji Tianxing into the secret chamber. The secret room wasn't big and the light was a little dim. When the two of them were alone, the atmosphere was always a little strange. Nangong Nihuang didn't say anything, so Ji Tianxing could only take the initiative to ask her to sit down on the futon made of ice and close her eyes to meditate. After she did so, Ji Tianxing sat opposite her again and used his magical secret technique to explore the injuries of her internal organs and meridians. The two of them were only a foot apart, and this was the first time Nangong Nihuang was so close to Ji Tianxing. Although she looked calm and composed on the surface, there were actually some waves in her heart, and the rhythm of her breathing was a little faster than usual. She didn't dare to open her eyes, nor did she dare to let her imagination run wild, lest she lose her composure in front of Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, had no distracting thoughts. He focused on using his magical technique to carefully examine her injuries. In the exceptionally quiet secret room, time seemed to have slowed down a lot. A quarter of an hour passed and Ji Tianxing had clearly examined Nangong Nihuang's injuries. After a moment of silence, he had a plan. Nangong Nihuang didn't hear him speak, and still maintained her meditative posture with her eyes closed. She even felt that 15 minutes was a little short. How did it end so quickly? Ji Tianxing coughed lightly, waking Nangong Nihuang up from her daze. Seeing Nangong Nihuang open her eyes, he said, "Your external injuries are a bit serious, but with medicinal pills and cultivation, you can recover within a year. But the injuries to your internal organs are even more severe, especially your divine blood and meridians. They are filled with 6 types of violent, poisonous, and corrosive divine power. If you don't get rid of those godly powers as soon as possible, your godly blood and meridians will be gradually corroded, causing your godly body to be damaged. More seriously, those forces would gradually invade one's sea of consciousness and corrode one's consciousness and Godhead. Once you reach that stage, your consciousness will be muddled and your divine Tao foundation will be destroyed. In the worst-case scenario, you will lose your life." Ji Tianxing explained the details of his injuries and the possible consequences to Nangong Nihuang. Nangong Nihuang also knew what the injury was and how it was caused, but she didn't expect the consequences to be so serious. She was a little shocked, but she immediately regained her composure and said with a calm expression, "It's okay, I will do my best to get rid of those godly powers." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "If you could get rid of those godly powers, you wouldn't be so weak now. Since I came to find you alone, I am here to help you treat your injuries. How can I let you treat your injuries on your own?" After that, he didn't care whether Nangong Nihuang agreed or not. He held her hands and said, "Concentrate on cultivating. Your mind and divine power will follow my guidance. I will help you treat your injuries, but I also need your cooperation." Nangong Nihuang seemed to have been electrocuted. Her body immediately stiffened and her mind went blank. She didn't expect this situation to come so suddenly, and she wasn't mentally prepared. Although she knew that the other party was treating her injuries and definitely didn't have any other intentions. He did. Cough, cough. It was easy for her to have some misunderstandings. Even if she calmed down and tried her best to remain calm, she couldn't help but blush and tremble in her heart. At this moment, her consciousness was a little absent-minded, and it was difficult for her to remain calm. She could only follow Ji Tianxing's guidance and passively circulate her divine power to heal her injuries. The process of healing was relatively simple and nothing special happened. It was just that the secret room was too quiet, and it was the first time Nangong Nihuang was so close to the person she loved. It was difficult for her to calm down and her mind wandered off many times. Fortunately, Ji Tianqing was strong enough to easily control the situation, guide her divine power to heal her injuries, and force out those violent godly powers one by one. Time passed silently. 40 hours had passed unknowingly. For nearly 2 days, Ji Tianqing endured his own injuries and continued to cultivate to help Nangong Nihuang heal her injuries. He was also a little tired. Nangong Nihuang's mood also completely calmed down, and she no longer let her imagination run wild. Feeling Ji Tianqing's fatigue, she no longer distracted and focused on cooperating with him to heal her injuries. During these 40 hours, their palms were pressed together. This was the most secure and warmest moment in Nangong Nihuang's heart in more than 1,000 years. She even felt that 40 hours was still too short. After the healing was over, the 6 violent powers in her body were all removed, and there were no more side effects. Even if she was a little reluctant, she didn't dare to be greedy for the warmth of his palm, and withdrew her palm in time. After Ji Tianqing finished his cultivation, he stood up and stood in the middle of the secret room. He warned, "The 6 types of divine power have been removed, but your internal injuries are too severe. You still need to recuperate for at least 10 years. Nangong Nihuang hurriedly got up, bowed to thank him, and said that she would focus on healing and strive to recover her strength as soon as possible. Ji Tianqing nodded and continued, "If you heal alone, it will take more than 10 years to recover. By that time, I'm afraid I'll have already left the God realm. It's too slow to heal here. I'll take you to another place and it'll save more time." When she heard this, Nangong Nihuang's heart couldn't help but beat faster. She had always been very intelligent, and she had long known that Kenshin's wife, children and friends were always by Kenshin's side, staying in a special divine artifact. In the past she didn't know what kind of divine artifact it was, but through this battle she saw Jiku controlling the Jutian Tenju Tower. Thus she guessed that Kenshin's most important friends and family were usually cultivating in that divine tower. With Ji Wuhan and Ji Wushuang's age, they could actually become God King experts. No matter how high their talent and aptitude were, it was still unprecedented and appalling. Thus, Nangong Nihuang guessed that the space inside the divine tower most likely had the effect of accelerating time. Now Kenshin said that he would take her to a place that could save time. The answer was obvious, and it was most likely to enter that divine tower. What did this mean? She had finally gained Kenshin's trust and care, and became one of his most important friends and family. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4353. Others might think that Kenshin just wanted her to recover from her injuries as soon as possible. But to her it had a different meaning. It was of vital importance. This meant that she was one step closer to Kenshin, and her identity had also changed slightly. This was definitely a pleasant surprise, and it was also an excellent start. Nangong Nihuang believed that as long as she continued to maintain her original heart, she would get closer and closer to her goal. Just as she was in a daze, Ji Tianqing had already opened the door and walked to the door of the secret room. "Follow me." Seeing that Nangong Nihuang was a little absent-minded, he didn't think much and casually called out to her. Only then did Nangong Nihuang come to her senses. She hurriedly followed, full of joy and anticipation as well as a little apprehension. Back in the room, Ji Tianqing took out the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda and opened a space passage. Then he personally brought Nangong Nihuang into the distorted space and time of the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda. Zhoosh! With a flash of white light, the two disappeared, leaving only the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda floating in the room, quietly rotating. The two flew in the distorted space where colorful and dark intertwined. Nangong Nihuang deliberately fell behind, following behind Ji Tianqing, silently looking around. In the dark and quiet void, many places were twisted and folded, glowing with colorful divine light. Looked very dreamy and blurry. Nangong Nihuang could sense that there was a problem with the flow of time in this void. It was different from the time in the outside world. Perhaps dozens of hours had passed here, but only 2 hours had passed in the God world. Of course, she understood how great the benefits of cultivating or healing in such a magical place were. The two traveled for thousands of miles and could see a huge dark red sacred tree in the depths of the void. The huge sacred tree, which was tens of thousands of feet tall, was surrounded by bloody flames that soared into the sky. It released an incomparably powerful aura and also provided endless divine power. In particular, Ji Tianqing had just fought with Pan Ruo. At that time, more than 20,000 Divine Lord soldiers were killed on the battlefield, and hundreds of Divine King experts fell. Such a huge battle and tragic casualties also allowed the bloody flame sacred tree to absorb an immeasurable amount of essence and blood souls, and its power increased by 70 to 80%. Nangong Nihuang stared at the bloody flame sacred tree for a moment and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. The grade of that sacred tree has probably already surpassed the high-grade king level and reached the top-grade king level. The divine tree continued to release its divine power essence and blood essence, filling the entire void. Cultivating near that sacred tree will definitely increase my strength. As expected, Ji Tianqing took the initiative to introduce it to her. This place is called the Distorted Spacetime. It's one of the most mysterious spaces in the 9 levels of the Divine Pagoda. The flow of time here is 50 times faster than the outside world. If you were to cultivate here for 50 years, only a year would have passed in the God world. In addition, that divine tree was called the Bloody Flame Divine Tree. It was a supreme grade king-level divine object. Let's go, I'll take you to see everyone. Ji Tianqing's explanation confirmed Nangong Nihuang's conjecture and made her feel more at ease and expectant. Soon, the two of them arrived at the foot of the Bloody Flame sacred tree and stood among the many floating platforms. Most of the floating platforms had people meditating and healing. They were very focused. Ji Tianqing and Nangong Nihuang didn't wake everyone up. They even used divine consciousness to communicate so as not to affect everyone's healing. He pointed at the people on the floating platforms and introduced them to Nangong Nihuang one by one. Nangong Nihuang knew that Kenshin had accepted her and allowed her to integrate into his circle of friends and family. That was why he introduced everyone to her. Therefore, she memorized everyone's image, temperament, and name so as not to confuse and forget. After Ji Tianqing finished his introduction, he saw that Nangong Nihuang was still thinking and seemed to be strengthening her memory. He couldn't help but smile. Don't be so nervous. You've already fought side by side with everyone. We're all friends from now on. Moreover, these people are very easy to get along with. You don't have to worry about anything. Nangong Nihuang naturally wasn't worried about people like Bai Feng, Chao Qingyu and Yank. However, among the people under the Bloody Flame sacred tree, there were Kenshin's wife Yin Yao and Ji Ku, as well as his son Ji Wuhan and daughter Ji Wushuang. In addition, there were 2 women named Lin Shui and Zhen Hong. They also had special temperaments and were stunning. Nangong Nihuang looked valiant and heroic, but she was actually very meticulous. How could she not be worried? However, she believed that people who could stay by Kenshin's side and become his family, friends, and subordinates were definitely not difficult to get along with and scheming people. There was a well-known example that was enough to prove this point. The Prajna God Emperor, who was known as the world's #1 female expert, was so infatuated with Kenshin back then, but she still couldn't capture Kenshin's heart. It was obvious that Kenshin never looked at the other party's strength and realm when he wanted to get to know someone. Nangong Nihuang quickly relaxed. Under Ji Tianqing's lead, they went to an empty floating platform. From now on, you can rest here and recuperate. Take this spatial ring. There are 200 billion cultivation resources inside. It should be enough for you to cultivate in seclusion for many years. After settling Nangong Nihuang down, Ji Tianqing took out a spatial ring and handed it to her. However, Nangong Nihuang refused to accept the spatial ring. I still have a lot of cultivation resources. It's enough for me to cultivate in seclusion and recuperate. You should take it back. Seeing that she refused to accept it, Ji Tianqing could only explain, this isn't a gift I'm giving you alone. It's a reward that you deserve. Everyone had participated in the previous battle. They had taken such a huge risk, suffered heavy injuries and even made great contributions. Not only you, I've prepared a reward for everyone. After saying that, he took out many spatial rings and showed them to Nangong Nihuang. Only then did Nangong Nihuang feel relieved. After hesitating for a moment, she accepted the spatial rings. Ji Tianqing smiled and gave her a few words of encouragement before turning to leave. He took the spatial rings and flew to each floating platform, placing a ring in front of everyone. The whole process was silent and did not affect everyone's recuperation. He believed that when everyone finished recuperating in seclusion or was forced to stop cultivating due to insufficient cultivation resources, they would see the spatial rings he left behind. He left a wisp of divine consciousness in each spatial ring, explaining to everyone that these resources were a reward that they deserved. After doing all this, Ji Tianxing returned to his personal floating platform and began to cultivate and recuperate. Nangong Nihuang silently watched all this. She only felt her heart grow warmer and warmer, and a gentle light flashed in her eyes. She collected her thoughts and began to focus on recuperating. At the same time, on the floating platform right next to Ji Tianxing, between Ji Wuhan and Ji Wushuang, Yunyao, who had been circulating and cultivating all this while, curved the corners of her mouth, revealing a trace of a gentle smile. Chapter 43-54. 10 days had passed since Ji Tianxing was ambushed by Pan Ruo and the battle between the two sides. At this time, the relevant news had finally spread across the Primal Chaos mainland. Although Ji Tianxing had just arrived in the Primal Chaos mainland and had yet to subdue any faction, he did not have any channels to release the news. However, of the 30,000 soldiers under Pan Ruo, 99% were killed, but there were still over 100 who escaped the net and escaped from the Sky Sword Mountain amidst the chaos. The news of the battle between Kenshin and Pan Ruo's incarnation was spread by these people. Pan Ruo God Emperor's incarnation predicted Kenshin's arrival in advance and set up an ambush at the Sky Sword Mountain ruins. As expected, he surrounded Kenshin. Pan Ruo God Emperor brought over 100 godly king experts and 30,000 elite soldiers to kill Kenshin and his disciples. However, Kenshin used his powerful divine ability to break through the encirclement. Kenshin had dozens of godly king experts following him. His strength and methods far exceeded the godly king realm and could stand shoulder to shoulder with the God Emperor. Both sides fought for 2 hours and in the end Kenshin won. Pan Ruo God Emperor's incarnation was forced to self-destruct, and the 100 godly king experts and 30,000 soldiers under his command were all annihilated. Such news spread from the mouths of the surviving soldiers and spread across the Primal Chaos mainland. After being spread and consolidated, the news gradually converged and could roughly describe the process of the matter. Thus, the peak factions of the Primal Chaos mainland, the various domain lords and godly king experts all knew of this earth-shattering secret. That's right, when this news spread across the Primal Chaos mainland, it was like a bolt from the blue, deafening everyone. No one dared to believe that Kenshin had actually silently arrived at the Primal Chaos mainland ahead of time. What was even more miraculous was that Pan Ruo God Emperor's incarnation had actually predicted Kenshin's movements and set up an ambush at the Sky Sword Mountain in advance. Originally, Pan Ruo God Emperor had made ample preparations and had set up an ambush with over 100 godly kings and 30,000 soldiers. This was definitely a huge gamble. If the gamble was right, he could kill Kenshin. If the gamble was wrong, he would fall into a passive state. However, Pan Ruo God Emperor's gamble was right and successfully surrounded Kenshin. But what was even more unbelievable and absurd was that Pan Ruo God Emperor's incarnation and 100 godly kings and 30,000 soldiers, they actually failed to kill Kenshin. On the contrary, the sword god broke through the encirclement and killed all of them. Even Pan Ruo God Emperor's incarnation was forced to self-destruct. This was simply too preposterous. No matter how strong he was, Ruo God, he's is to kill. Even Pan Ruo God, is body. Primal Chaos mainland's Ruo God too. Countless powerhouses and experts were crazily discussing the result of the battle between Emperor God Pan Ri and Sword God. They were all amazed and shocked. And God to be fake. No matter how strong Kenshin was, it was impossible for him to be so heaven-defying. In their hearts, the strongest woman in the world, the only female God Emperor, could not possibly be so weak. But as more and more news spread, the story became clearer and clearer. Furthermore, the people who spread the news were all soldiers under the command of the Great Wisdom God Emperor. They had personally experienced that battle. Everyone had no choice but to believe it. They could only slowly accept the news. In the following half a month, hundreds of regions, divine kingdoms and countless cities in the Primal Chaos continent were discussing this news. To the hundreds of millions of people, this was naturally something worth celebrating. It made them feel pleasantly surprised and excited. They looked left and right, and after waiting for so long, the sword god finally appeared. Moreover, Kenshin had destroyed the incarnation of the Prajna god emperor and wiped out an army of 30,000 before even making an appearance. What did this mean? The primal chaos continent was already in Kenshin's pocket and would soon be subdued. Perhaps in a month or two, the billions of people would be able to escape the sea of suffering and obtain freedom. The people rejoiced and the slaves were extremely excited. They were filled with admiration and gratitude towards Kenshin. But the leaders of the hundreds of regions, the nobles of all levels, especially the rulers of the primal chaos continent, were filled with anxiety and fear. They were also very clear that the incarnation of the Prajna god emperor had been destroyed. 30,000 elite soldiers had been killed. The primal chaos continent's defensive power had been reduced by nearly half. Even if godly King Xianxia was the overlord of the continent in name, he was still overseeing the primal chaos grotto heaven. He had at least 60 to 70,000 elite soldiers under his command. But godly King Xianxia was only a peak godly king and was also the disciple of Prajna. Even the incarnation of the Prajna god emperor had been destroyed by Kenshin. Godly King Xianxia could only be instantly killed by Kenshin. The 60 to 70,000 elite soldiers without a leader were also unable to pose a threat to Kenshin. Only death awaited them. The nobles, leaders and rulers realized that the fall of the primal chaos continent was certain. Amidst their anxiety and realization, they began to plan their escape route. Most of the nobles and rulers wanted to quickly plunder their wealth and escape with all their wealth. But when they thought about it carefully, Boundless Heaven Continent, Reincarnation Island, and Xianxia Continent were already under Kenshin's control. The primal chaos continent was about to fall. It was only a matter of time before Qiankun Continent was conquered. Not long after, the entire God realm would become Kenshin's territory. Even if they took all the resources and wealth, where could they escape to? After serious consideration, many experts and nobles chose to escape to the primal chaos grotto heaven and seek help from godly King Xianxia. They believed that godly King Xianxia would be able to make a decision and know where to escape to in order to survive. The truth was indeed so. Another portion of the leaders, nobles and rulers felt that the God realm would eventually be controlled by Kenshin. They already had no way to escape. They also heard that Kenshin ruled Boundless Heaven, Xianxia and Reincarnation Island, but did not harm the innocent. Even the leaders were rarely killed. Most of them maintained their original positions. As long as they were willing to surrender and be loyal to Kenshin and swear a strict heavenly oath, they would not be in any danger. Moreover, these nobles and leaders did not want to leave their homes, escape from the God realm and live a wandering life. So after much consideration they all made up their minds. Once Kenshin appeared in public, they would immediately express their intention to surrender and be loyal. If they were loyal early enough and acted smarter and more appropriately, they might be able to gain Kenshin's favor and win greater power and status. In short, the primal chaos continent began to fall into chaos. The common people cheered wildly, looking forward to Kenshin's call for action. Countless experts and forces would follow. The nobles were busy plundering resources and transferring their wealth and forces to seek refuge with godly King Xianxia. Some nobles gathered their forces and put on a posture of waiting to surrender. Even the most sacred and dignified primal chaos grotto heaven became very lively. In the past, the grotto heaven was very quiet and heavily guarded. Now, countless experts were gathering their soldiers, gathering their forces, transferring their wealth and resources and preparing to leave. Chapter 43-55. Logically speaking, the chaotic mainland was currently in a period of chaos. Many territorial lords and nobles were either planning to surrender or pack up their belongings and flee. Even the experts and soldiers in the chaotic grotto heaven were preparing to flee at any time. To Kenshin, this was the best opportunity to attack and conquer the chaotic mainland quickly. As long as he showed up, there was no need for a battle. He only needed to raise his arm and call for help to conquer half of the mainland. But what puzzled everyone was that Kenshin did not appear. Unknowingly, a month had passed. With this 1-month buffer, many of the territorial lords and nobles were fully prepared. Those who remained in their territories and resided in the territorial lord manor and cave abodes were naturally prepared to surrender and pledge their loyalty. As for the nobles and experts who were preparing to flee, a portion of them left in private. Most of them gathered in the chaotic grotto heaven and followed godly King Xianxia. Early in the morning the sun rose from the east. The chaotic grotto heaven was no longer quiet. Outside the majestic chaotic divine palace, there were more than 50 divine warships lined up in the sky. The 10 divine warships at the front of the fleet were godly King Xia's divine warships and the divine generals under her command. Each divine warship carried 3,000 elite soldiers. Godly King Xia's divine warship was of the highest grade. It was a supreme grade divine warship. Not only did it carry 3,000 loyal imperial guards, but it also stored immeasurable cultivation resources. The other 40 divine warships came from the various territorial lords and top forces. Each divine warship not only carried the trusted soldiers of the various territorial lords, but it was also filled with rich cultivation resources and treasures. With the loud sound of a horn, godly King Xia's divine warship took off and flew towards the exit of the chaotic grotto heaven. The other 9 divine warships followed closely behind. The fleets of the various territorial lords also took off and flew off in a grandiose manner. 15 minutes later, the huge fleet left the chaotic grotto heaven and sped up into the sky. They passed through the spatial barrier and entered the void outside. Just like that, Crimson Afterglow swaggered out of the divine realm with his massive fleet and treasures. Originally, godly King Xia was worried that they would be hunted down by Kenshin if they left the divine world so brazenly. For safety's sake, she wanted the fleet to escape quietly. However, the Prajna God Emperor had sent her a message, telling her not to worry. Now that Crimson Afterglow had left the deity world with his fleet, nothing unexpected had happened. After entering the void, her heart finally calmed down. She was full of admiration for the Prajna God Emperor's deduction. Although Crimson Afterglow had taken away more than 50 divine warships, as well as 1,000 years of accumulated wealth, Crimson Afterglow had still managed to escape. However, the Chaos Paradise was not empty. There were still 2,000 guards, 1,000 maids and 3,000 servants. There was nothing that could be done about it. These guards, maids and servants were rather weak, or perhaps their statuses were not high enough, so they were not taken away by Crimson Afterglow. Perhaps God Monarch Crimson Afterglow felt that bringing them along would be a burden. The 6,000 guards and attendants who were left behind had no choice but to stand their ground under Crimson Afterglow's orders. The guards continued to guard the entrances and exits of the grotto heaven and the gates of the various palaces. The maids and servants were still guarding the various palaces. They were abandoned pawns. All of them were trembling in fear and unease. After Crimson Afterglow left with his fleet, many guards, maids and servants gathered their courage and fled the Chaos Paradise. These abandoned pawns were in the same situation. They should have fled together. However, when many maids and servants fled, there were 2 guard commanders who refused to flee and even persuaded them to stay. Of the maids, servants and guards who yearned for freedom, more than 2,000 of them fled. However, the remaining 3,000 plus people stayed in the Chaos Grotto Heaven under the persuasion and obstruction of the 2 guard commanders. These people could still remain calm. The guard commanders persuaded them that when they were in the Chaos Paradise in the past, they had extravagant living conditions and ample cultivation resources. The Chaos Paradise was a holy land for cultivation. As long as they stayed, it would be 10 times better than cultivating in the outside world. Now that they had fled the Chaos Paradise and returned to the Chaos mainland, who could they seek refuge from? Those domain lords and nobles could not even protect themselves. Who could find a backer and be sure of their safety? Rather than that, they might as well stay in the Chaos Paradise and wait for Kenshin to take over. When the time came, they could directly surrender and pledge their loyalty. Kenshin was famous for his decisiveness in killing and was known as the god of slaughter. However, ever since he returned to the divine realm and conquered 3 continents, he had never killed the innocent. Now that Crimson Afterglow had fled with his army, these small fries were not worth Kenshin's effort. There was also no need for them to remain loyal and protect the Chaos mainland. In any case, once Kenshin arrived, they would definitely be fine as long as they kowtowed. If they were smarter and made arrangements in advance, they might be able to gain Kenshin's favor. That would be a pleasant surprise. Everyone in the Chaos mainland was puzzled. Why had Kenshin disappeared for a month? There was no need to ask. Everyone knew that the Chaos mainland was in a state of chaos. The various domain lords and nobles were fleeing in panic. Why did Kenshin not take the opportunity to attack and conquer the Chaos mainland? Billions of commoners could not figure it out. Many nobles, powers and experts could not figure it out either. In less than 2 days, The news of Crimson Afterglow leading an army to flee the Chaos Mainland also spread. As such, the Chaos Mainland was completely abandoned by Crimson Afterglow and the Prajna God Emperor. It became a land without a master waiting for Kenshin to conquer it. Many commoners felt that it was a pity that Kenshin did not intercept Crimson Afterglow, allowing her to take away so many soldiers and cultivation resources. This made many busybodies speculate. Why did Kenshin show mercy? Because Crimson Afterglow was the only disciple of the Prajna God Emperor? Although Kenshin and the Prajna God Emperor's incarnation had a great battle and forced the Prajna God Emperor's incarnation to self-destruct, there were still feelings between them. The kind of feelings that lingered between the two of them? Did Kenshin and the Prajna God Emperor have an agreement that the previous battle would determine victory and defeat? The loser would leave the Chaos Mainland and the other party would not pursue them? Similar speculations were announced by those busybodies and spread throughout the Chaos Mainland. These speculations sounded absurd, but upon careful thought they seemed to make some sense. In addition, the commoners of the Chaos Mainland all knew that there was an unclear relationship between Kenshin and the Prajna God Emperor. Therefore, these groundless speculations actually won the approval of countless people. After the rumors were widely spread, more and more people actually agreed with these speculations. Of course, gossiping about Kenshin and Prajna was only one of the ways the commoners dispelled their worries. They still hoped that Kenshin would appear as soon as possible to conquer the Chaos Mainland and pacify the chaos. Chapter 43-56. About 10 days had passed since God King Xianxia led his army out of the divine world. The situation in the Chaos Mainland had become even more chaotic. There were more than 50 regions where the territorial lords had led their trusted soldiers to escape. The entire region had lost its jurisdiction and restraint. The conflicts that had been suppressed between the empires and the divine nations for many years gradually erupted. Small-scale conflicts and wars had begun. For the sake of power and profit, the various levels of forces also erupted into rounds of conflict. Although all the citizens, nobles and powers knew that the Chaos Mainland would definitely be conquered by Kenshin, people were selfish and greedy. But the human heart was selfish and greedy. They all wanted to plunder more resources and control more territories before Sword God unified the primal chaos continent. As the situation in the 50 regions became more and more chaotic, the 40 regions guarded by territorial lords also began to show signs of chaos. Fortunately, those territorial lords still had a certain degree of deterrence. They could send out elite soldiers to suppress the chaos and wars in various regions and prevent the chaos from spreading. Even so, the various territorial lords were having headaches and felt that they could not do anything else. They could only hope that Kenshin would appear soon and take control of the situation. Finally, another 3 days passed. Kenshin finally appeared. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship and carried Ji Tianxing and the rest to the Chaos Grotto Heaven in the center of the continent. At this time, Ji Tianxing had already been cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for 5.5 years. His internal injuries had already recovered by 80%, but he had not fully recovered. There was no choice. For an expert at his level, once he was injured, especially internal injuries, it would take more than 3 to 5 years to recover. As for Yun Yao, Jiku and the rest as well as those followers, their injuries were even more serious. Now they were still cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime. It would take them a few years or even more than a decade to gradually recover. Needless to say, those followers who did not enter the distorted spacetime and stayed in the god-slaying battleship, they had only been recuperating for more than 40 days. Their injuries had just been controlled and stabilized. Ji Tianxing originally wanted to wait until his injuries had healed or everyone's injuries had mostly healed before he appeared to conquer the Chaos Mainland. Although God King Xianxia, the territorial lords and nobles did not have the heart to fight. If he stepped forward to subdue the primal Chaos Mainland, he should not encounter any resistance. However, it was impossible for him to complete such a huge workload alone. He needed the help of others. However, things were developing too quickly. As God King Xianxia led his army out of the divine world, the situation in the primal Chaos Mainland quickly turned into a pot of porridge. To Ji Tianxing, he didn't care if the primal Chaos Mainland was in chaos or not. However, the situation on the continent was chaotic. Dozens of regions were engulfed in the flames of war, and countless civilians were being ravaged by the flames of war. This was something he did not want to see, so he could only show up in advance to quell the chaos as soon as possible. Shua. The deity-slaying worship arrived at the entrance of the primal chaos paradise. It remained invisible and concealed its divine aura. Ji Tianxing stood in the cockpit and observed the situation at the grotto heaven entrance 100 miles away. Initially he thought that Xianxia deity king had taken away all the soldiers and valuables, leaving the chaos paradise empty. Who would have thought that the chaos grotto heaven would leave behind a group of guards to guard the entrance of the grotto heaven? White Dragon looked at Ji Tianxing and asked in a low voice, "Master, should we kill our way over stealthily or show up directly to intimidate them?" Ji Tianxing waved his hand and said, "When God King Xianxia led so many people to escape, I did not even make a move to kill them. Do you think I will kill these useless soldiers and crab generals? Moreover, it's just over 1,000 guards. Do you think they will resist?" Understood. White Dragon immediately understood what his master meant. He removed the deity-slaying worship's disguise and revealed its tracks and aura. The deity-slaying worship flew towards the grotto heaven's entrance at a moderate speed. The guards guarding the grotto heaven's entrance immediately discovered the deity-slaying worship and were all shocked. However, those guards quickly calmed down and did not show any signs of panic. Perhaps it was because the two guard commanders had already rehearsed with everyone, allowing them to be mentally prepared. When they saw the deity-slaying worship fly in front of them, they stood even straighter and tried their best to show that they were full of energy and spirit, making themselves appear very elite. This was also the main point that the two guard commanders had instructed everyone. They had to perform very well to have a chance of being retained by Kenshin and even gain Kenshin's favor. The deity-slaying worship's cabin door opened. Ji Tianxing was the first to step out of the cabin door, and White Dragon followed closely behind. The master and disciple duo kept the deity-slaying worship and stood in the sky. They looked at the guards guarding the entrance and quietly sized them up. Two guard commanders in bright armor and bright cloaks immediately flew over side by side. They stopped 100 steps away from Ji Tianxing and bowed respectfully. "We pay our respects to Lord Kenshin." As the two guard commanders bowed, the many armored and sword-wielding guards also turned to face Ji Tianxing and bowed in unison. Such a scene was like soldiers being inspected by a general. Although the guard commanders had not declared that they were surrendering and pledging their allegiance, they had already used their actions to express their intentions of loyalty. Under such circumstances, as long as one was not a cruel and bloodthirsty person, they would not attack the guards. The two guard commanders and the many guards looked calm on the surface and did not show any abnormalities, but in reality, their hearts were in their throats and their palms were sweating. They had already declared that they would pledge their allegiance to Kenshin. But they did not know what Kenshin's attitude was at the moment. Who could guarantee that Kenshin would retain them and not kill them with a single blow of his sword? If that was really the case, they would not even have the chance to resist and would die unjustly. Thus, after the many guards bowed, they silently waited for Kenshin's response, and also for the judgment of fate. Fortunately, Kenshin did not make them wait for long. After a breath, everyone saw Kenshin raise his hands and say indifferently, "No need for formalities, all rise." At this moment, when everyone heard these 6 words, it was as if they had heard the sound of nature. With these 6 words and Kenshin's tone, the guards could feel that Kenshin did not have the slightest murderous intent and had temporarily accepted them. Whether they could stay and become Kenshin's subordinates to continue guarding the Chaos Grotto Heaven was uncertain for the time being. But at least Kenshin would not kill them for the time being and their lives would be saved. Next, it would depend on their performance. The two guard commanders were very tactful and quickly ordered the guards to open the entrance to the Grotto Heaven. Then they personally led the way and respectfully welcomed Ji Tianxing into the Chaos Grotto Heaven. At the same time, 2 guards in charge of transmitting messages quickly sent messages to the guards and servants inside the Grotto Heaven, telling them that Kenshin had arrived and was ready to welcome him. Chapter 43-57. Of the 3,000 people left in the Chaos Paradise, half were guards and the other half were maids and servants. Most of the guards remained at the entrance of the paradise, but there were still guards guarding the various palaces and passageways within the paradise. The maids and servants had also made preparations in advance. 15 minutes later, 2 guard commanders brought Ji Tianxing and Bai Long to the Chaos Divine Palace. They were at the center of the paradise on the most majestic mountain range. Within a radius of 500 miles, There were dozens of mountain peaks with countless palaces and mansions. Half a month ago, tens of thousands of soldiers and many God King experts had lived in these splendid palaces and exquisite mansions. Now the soldiers had left and the various palaces and mansions were empty. Only a small number of servants and maids remained, guarding the key and important palaces. The two guard commanders brought Ji Tianxing and his disciple to the tallest mountain peak in the middle of the valley. The majestic palace at the peak of the mountain was the famous chaotic divine palace. Outside the palace, there were already more than 1,000 guards, servants, and maids lined up neatly in 3 lines, waiting respectfully for Kenshin's grand arrival. Seeing Kenshin arrive, everyone suppressed the excitement in their hearts, suppressed the fear and worry in their hearts and bowed in unison. "Greetings to Lord Kenshin." A loud voice rang out from the mountain peak and reverberated in the air. More than 1,000 guards and servants prostrated themselves respectfully on the ground, not daring to raise their heads to look at Kenshin, lest they offend him. They were very nervous and didn't even dare to breathe loudly. They held their breaths and waited with rapt attention for Kenshin's response to decide their fate. Judging from Kenshin's attitude toward the guards at the paradise's entrance, he probably wouldn't kill them. However, those were guards with combat strength, and the 1,000 people in the plaza were mostly maids and servants with relatively low combat strength. If Kenshin felt that they were useless and would only be a burden, then their fate would be worrying. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait too long before Kenshin's voice rang out in the plaza. "You may all rise." Although these words were simple, when the guards, maids and servants heard it, they felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders, and they felt as if they had escaped death. Next, the two guard commanders mustered up their courage and took the initiative to introduce the current situation of the Chaos Grotto Heaven to Ji Tianxing. "Lord Kenshin, please allow me to brief you on the current situation of the Chaos Paradise." Ji Tianxing took the lead and walked towards Chaos Divine Palace's meeting hall. Seeing the two guards trembling in fear, he nodded slightly and said, "Speak." After receiving a positive answer, the two guard commanders relaxed and hurriedly explained, 13 days ago, Xianxia deity king led 30,000 soldiers, more than 40 domain masters and experts, and a fleet of more than 50 deity warships. They took away most of the resources and treasures and left the Chaos Paradise, escaping from the God realm. Our guards, servants and maidservants are all staying in the Chaos Paradise. There were some that Crimson Afterglow God King wasn't willing to take with him. He felt that they were a burden. There are also some guards who are unwilling to leave the God realm and are willing to remain loyal to you. Therefore we are staying in the Chaos Paradise to guard the entrances and the various palaces and residences here, patiently waiting for your arrival. Everyone knew that the guards, servants and maidservants who stayed behind were all burdens that Xianxia deity king disliked. But the two guard commanders couldn't say that. What if Kenshin also disliked them as burdens? They could only say half-truths, saying that some of them were abandoned by Xianxia deity king, and most of them stayed behind voluntarily. In this way they tactfully expressed that they were still useful and that they were willing to remain loyal to Kenshin. Ji Tianxing was well aware of this, but he didn't care about it. He only said in a dignified tone, "The guards under your command as well as the servants and maidservants, do what you are supposed to do. From now on the Chaos Paradise will need your protection and maintenance." This sentence was equivalent to giving the two guard commanders an affirmative answer. It calmed their hearts and dispelled all their doubts. The two guard commanders' hanging hearts immediately fell back into their stomachs. On behalf of the guards, servants and maidservants, they expressed their gratitude to Ji Tianxing. After that, Ji Tianxing entered the Chaos Divine Palace's conference hall and officially took his seat. The two guard commanders were much more courageous now. They introduced more information and situation to Ji Tianxing. For example, they knew about the defense of the Chaos Divine Palace and the surrounding palaces, as well as the details of the array layout. They also knew about the entire Chaos Divine Palace's topography, layout and structure, as well as some hidden terrains. The two guard commanders were already very good. They assumed their identities as Kenshin's subordinates and took advantage of this opportunity to perform well. In this way, Ji Tianxing only took 15 minutes to have a clear understanding of the Chaos Paradise. He didn't need to spend a few hours to personally explore it. After the two guard commanders finished their report, Ji Tianxing gave them a series of orders. First, the two guard commanders had to restrain the guards, servants, and maidservants to continue guarding the Chaos Paradise and listen to orders. Secondly, they had to announce Kenshin's personal order to the world as soon as possible. As long as they spread the news that Kenshin had appeared, controlled the Chaos Paradise, and was about to conquer the Chaos Mainland, they could quickly calm the chaos in the Chaos Mainland. In addition, Ji Tianqing had to summon the various territorial lords to the Chaos Paradise for an audience. Those territorial lords who stayed in their respective regions and cave dwellings had already made up their minds to surrender. What they were waiting for was Kenshin to personally appear and wait for Kenshin's order. Although some of these missions were easy to complete, others were very difficult. But the two guard commanders knew that this was a test of their abilities by Kenshin. They agreed without hesitation and quickly carried out the mission. After the two guard commanders left, Ji Tianqing began to wander around the Chaos Divine Palace alone. The guards and servants had already left the square and returned to their posts. Ji Tianqing was strolling in the quiet palace without being disturbed at all. He first went to the most important study and a few secret rooms in the Chaos Divine Palace. These were the places where Crimson Dawn and the two marshals often appeared. Although the rooms and secret rooms were sealed with arrays, they couldn't stop him. He was the first to discover something in Crimson Dawn's study. On the white jade table in the study there was a jade slip. It didn't look like it had been left behind. It looked more like it had been deliberately placed there for him to see. He picked up the jade slip and used his consciousness to read its contents. A dignified female voice rang out in his mind. Chapter 4358. Senior Kenshin, by the time you see this jade slip, this junior will have already left the God realm with the soldiers under my command and the wealth and resources I have accumulated over the past 1,000 years. I trust that with your wisdom, you have long since guessed the result and where this junior and my group will go. Although this junior has always respected your name, and when I learned of the defeat of my master's incarnation, I also wanted to fight with you to avenge my master. However, as a disciple I can only obey my master's orders. Here I also thank you for showing mercy and giving this junior the time and opportunity to retreat. If we meet again in the void, this junior will eventually seek your guidance. I hope that you will not be stingy with your guidance. Clearly, this woman, who sounded to be in her 30s, full of vigor and majesty, came from Crimson Dawn. This was the jade slip she had left behind for Ji Tianqing to read before she led the soldiers away. In just a few short sentences she revealed a lot of information but also many details. For example, she knew of the dispute between her master, the Prajna God Emperor, and Kenshin. Even if Kenshin and her master were enemies, she still had to be respectful. She had left the Chaos Paradise with her soldiers and all her wealth to seek refuge with the Prajna God Emperor because she had no choice but to do so. Although she had received orders from the Prajna God Emperor, she still harbored resentment and hatred toward Kenshin. If not for her master's orders, she would have challenged Kenshin even if she knew she was no match for him. Even if she had escaped from the God realm, she was still unwilling. If they met in the void in the future, she would still attack Kenshin. Another example was that Crimson Dawn had guessed that Kenshin had given her so much time to prepare, allowing her to calmly retreat without stopping her. This must have been some kind of tacit understanding or agreement between her master, the Prajna God Emperor, and Kenshin. She had always admired Kenshin's character. Apart from this, there were also some other details that were not worth mentioning. In short, Ji Tianqing read the contents of the jade slip, smiled faintly and crushed the jade slip into powder. He vaguely remembered seeing the female disciple of the Prajna God Emperor more than 1,000 years ago. At that time, the female disciple named Xianxia was tall and big. She did not have the elegance of a girl. Instead, she looked valiant and heroic. She didn't like silk and satin, but preferred exquisite armor and cloaks. She was good at fighting and had a fiery temper. Ji Tianqing absolutely believed that if Crimson Afterglow hadn't received his master's orders, he would definitely have defended the primal Chaos Paradise and fought him to the death. Since God Monarch Crimson Afterglow left him such a jade slip, then there was no need for him to check the treasury. Without a doubt, with Crimson Afterglow's personality, he would definitely move or destroy everything. Not even a single divine stone would be left. It wasn't that God King Crimson Afterglow was lacking in cultivation resources. He just wanted to annoy him. In addition, there was probably no need to carefully inspect the various palaces and residences in the Grotto Heaven. The houses and buildings were definitely well preserved, and the defensive formations were definitely still functional. It was for no other reason than the Prajna God Emperor's instructions. There was a hint of tacit understanding between her and Ji Tianqing. It was Ji Tianqing's suggestion before the battle. The Prajna God Emperor would bring his people and leave the primal chaos continent under Ji Tianqing's control, but Ji Tianqing would not harm the soldiers under his command. Although the Prajna God Emperor's incarnation had been destroyed, she could not carry out this agreement. But she would definitely tell God Monarch Crimson Afterglow that he had to do this and do his best to make things convenient for Kenshin. This way, Kenshin would not kill God Monarch Crimson Afterglow and his tens of thousands of soldiers. Only then would he be able to smoothly take over the primal chaos continent and treat all the people well. Even the experts, factions, and soldiers who had originally been the Prajna God Emperor would not be purged or retaliated against. This was the agreement and tacit understanding between the two sides. A day later, the two guard commanders completed the task Ji Tianqing had given them and came to report. The news that Kenshin had taken over the primal chaos grotto heaven and was about to fully take over the primal chaos continent had already been released. The decree in Kenshin's tone had also been issued and transmitted to dozens of domain lords. It was likely that countless domain lords and experts of many top factions would soon rush to the primal chaos grotto heaven to pay respects to Kenshin and swear allegiance to him. Moreover, Kenshin's former subordinates and followers would be able to boldly appear and meet him in the primal chaos grotto heaven after receiving the news. Ji Tianqing was in no hurry to expand his manpower, nor did he awaken those followers in the god-slaying battleship and Jiotian 10 Absolutes Pagoda who were still recuperating in seclusion. In any case, he was alone in the primal chaos grotto heaven. Ordering the two guard commanders and more than 1,000 guards and servants to do things was enough. No matter how chaotic the situation in the primal chaos continent was, with frequent conflicts and wars breaking out between the various regions, these were conflicts between the various major factions and divine kingdoms. No one would be so daring as to invade the primal chaos grotto heaven, much less seize the opportunity to seize power. In fact, after Kenshin's decree to take over the primal chaos continent was issued, the various divine kingdoms and factions had to end their conflicts and wars as soon as possible and return to peace. After the decree was announced to the world, Kenshin would definitely pay attention to which factions and countries were still at war. What awaited them would definitely be severe punishment. This was something that any expert with some intelligence would be able to figure out. The truth was indeed so. In a short 3 days, the news that Kenshin had taken over the primal chaos continent and summoned all the domain lords to the primal chaos grotto heaven for a meeting spread throughout the primal chaos continent. Billions of people cheered. After a long wait, they were finally going to regain their freedom. The anxious hearts of the various domain masters finally settled back into their stomachs. After some preparations, they all embarked on their journey to the primal chaos grotto heaven. As for the various factions and divine kingdoms, they were also rapidly retracting their forces, gradually stopping and retreating from the battlefield. No matter what the final outcome was, no matter who was at a disadvantage or who was at an advantage, they had to restrain themselves and obediently stop. Just like that, the originally chaotic primal chaos continent miraculously regained its peace in a short few days. This was the prestige of Kenshin, the deterrence of Kenshin. In the next 20 days, there were more or less godly king experts rushing to the primal chaos grotto heaven. Among them were the various domain lords, the clan leaders, guardians and elders of the ancient clans, as well as some leaders of the top factions. Kenshin had only summoned the various domain lords to the primal chaos grotto heaven for an audience and to pledge their loyalty. However, the leaders of the ancient clans and top factions all understood that this was an excellent opportunity for them. They had to seize the opportunity and quickly rush to the primal chaos grotto heaven to pay a visit to Kenshin and express their loyalty and allegiance to Kenshin. Only then would they be able to gain the favor of Kenshin and possibly obtain some positions and benefits. After all, more than 40 domain lords had followed godly King Xianxia and escaped from the divine realm. The positions of domain lords were now empty and had to be replaced by experts. Whoever pledged their loyalty to Kenshin first would have a better chance. Chapter 4359. This time, Ji Tianqing didn't let whoever arrived first take the oath of allegiance first like in the past. All the domain lords and experts who had rushed to the Chaos Paradise had to stay in the Chaos Paradise. When more domain lords and experts arrived, Ji Tianqing thought that everyone was present, Then he would let them all swear their loyalty together. Those domain lords and experts were filled with excitement and anticipation when they met Kenshin, but they could not immediately swear their loyalty. After meeting Kenshin, they were arranged to stay in the palaces and courtyards used for guests. Without Kenshin's summons they could not move around freely, nor could they take the initiative to meet Kenshin. This caused those experts who wanted to get close to him to gain benefits and positions in advance to be filled with disappointment. However, the attentive experts discovered that there was an extremely small number of people who seemed to have special privileges. They were mysterious experts who had concealed their identities and had not shown their faces for thousands of years. There were also some people who had never heard of or seen before. Most of them were experts who had changed their appearances. After entering the Chaos Paradise, they met Kenshin mysteriously and were able to converse with Kenshin for a long time. In addition, they were able to meet Kenshin many times to discuss certain matters. This scene was seen by some domain lords and leaders of forces. Of course, they were puzzled and unwilling to accept this. They gathered together and secretly discussed before paying attention to the movements in the Chaos Divine Palace. Finally, on a certain evening when the sun was setting, another mysterious expert stepped into the Chaos Grotto Heaven. It was an old man who wore a black robe that was like a tattered piece of cloth. His figure was thin, his waist was bent, and his feet were dry like tree bark. He held an ancient cane in his hand and wore a tattered bamboo hat. His movements were slow and he coughed as he walked. He looked old and sickly. But it was undeniable that he was at the 7th or 8th level of the God King realm, but his aura was very dim. No matter when, a high-level God King would not be in such a miserable state, and it was even more impossible for him to be dressed like this. When the domain lords and leaders saw this, they guessed that this mysterious expert of unknown origin would definitely be able to meet the sword god. Moreover, he would most likely be favored and taken care of by Kenshin, just like the previous mysterious experts. The domain lords and leaders were unconvinced and insisted on following the old man in the bamboo hat secretly to see what was going on. They used invisibility techniques to hide their auras and quietly followed the old man into the Chaos Divine Palace, arriving outside the study. Everyone hid in the rockery and the forest near the study, quietly listening to the movements in the study. As expected, after the old man entered the study, he saw Lord Kenshin. What happened next stunned the territorial lords and the leaders of the various forces. In the quiet study room, Lin Yiqian could be seen. Ji Tianxing stared at the old man in tattered clothes. He frowned and observed the old man in the Chaos Divine Palace. Yi Wuji, you've finally perfected your disguise. With Ji Tianxing's strength, he could see through most disguises at a glance. And this old man in the bamboo hat called Yi Wuji, after Ji Tianxing sized him up, could be completely sure. It could be seen that Yi Wuji's disguise had indeed reached perfection and was unique. After Ji Tianxing saw through his disguise and called out his name, Yi Wuji immediately knelt on the ground, threw away his cane, took off his tattered bamboo hat and bowed emotionally. Disciple Yi Wuji greets master. At this moment, Yi Wuji was no longer trembling and feeble. His voice was no longer the voice of an old man who was about to die, but the voice of a middle-aged man who was full of energy and decisiveness. And when he knelt on the ground and bowed, he cast a spell to remove his disguise. In the blink of an eye, he changed from a withered and skinny old man to a burly middle-aged man whose aura was as sharp as a sword. Although he was only wearing simple black clothes and his hair was tied up in a bun with a sword-shaped hairpin, his outfit was very simple. However, he was like a treasured sword that had just been unsheathed. A moment ago he was still an old man, but now he had become a sharp sword that had just been unsheathed. The gap between the two was too big. Ji Tianxing looked at Yi Wuji, who was kneeling at his feet. Seeing that he looked the same as before but with a bit more vicissitudes of life, he was very gratified. Yi Wuji, it's not easy for you to survive and disguise yourself in the secular world. Get up. The other two senior brothers are still waiting for you. Hearing Ji Tianxing's words, Yi Wuji was also very emotional. He hurriedly bowed and thanked Ji Tianxing. Thank you, master. Hiding outside the study and secretly watching this scene, the leaders of the other regions and forces suddenly understood. Yi Wuji, he calls Kenshin master? I remember now. He is one of the 6 sword leaders. He is the Wuji sword leader. So it's the Wuji sword leader. Oh my god, I thought all of Kenshin's subordinates had fallen in that great battle. I didn't expect the Wuji sword leader to still be alive. He actually disguised himself as an old man and mixed in with the world without being discovered. Just now, Kenshin said that other than the Wuji sword leader, there are 2 other senior brothers waiting for him. Could it be that there are 2 more sword leaders alive? That should be the case. I finally understand. No wonder those mysterious powerhouses were able to receive Kenshin's attention. They were his old subordinates. The domain lords and the leaders of the various forces were discussing this in secret, and the truth was revealed. Before coming, they were very confused and jealous of those mysterious powerhouses. Why were they treated so specially by Kenshin? Now that they knew the reason, they had nothing to say. Back then, Kenshin had the left and right protectors, the 6 sword leaders, the 8 divine generals, and the 10 divine kings. The left and right protectors were Kenshin's right-hand men. However, they had fallen in the great battle of the gods. The 6 sword leaders had also suffered heavy casualties. After the great battle, they disappeared without a trace. Everyone thought that they had died in battle. Every sword champion was a top sword Dao grandmaster in the world. They were powerful people who had created countless sword Dao theurgies. However, the 6 sword leaders could only call themselves disciples in front of Kenshin. After all, Kenshin was the world's #1 sword Dao grandmaster. At this moment, the Wuji sword leader bowed to Ji Tianqing and entered the underground palace through a secret door in the corner of the study. The 2 sword leaders who had come to the Chaos Grotto Heaven earlier than him and Kenshin's former subordinates were all in the underground palace. The Wuji sword leader entered the dimly lit underground palace with excitement and nervousness. He wanted to meet his senior and junior brothers and the generals who had fought side by side with him. There were already more than 20 people gathered in the underground palace. Among them, the strongest and most powerful were the Celestial Wind Sword Leader and the Celestial Spring Sword Leader. Other than that, Limitless Sword Leader also saw the 3 survivors of the 8 Extreme Divine Generals, as well as the 4 survivors of the 10 Directional Divine Kings. Chapter 4360. 1,000 years ago, Kenshin had many experts under his command, and all of them were God King experts. The most famous ones were the left and right protectors, the 6 Path Sword Chiefs, the 8 Extreme Generals, and the 10 Directional Divine Kings. Other than that, there were more than 100 intermediate God Kings, more than 200 lower God Kings, and tens of thousands of Monarch God experts. There were more than 20 people in the underground palace. Other than the 2 Sword Chiefs, the 3 Divine Generals, and the 4 Directional Divine Kings, there were more than a dozen God King experts. Some of them were Kenshin's generals, some were Kenshin's followers, and some were upper God Kings, and some were guardians and elders of the ancient clans. During the Battle of the Gods, not only did Kenshin's subordinates participate, but many of the top forces and ancient clans that were loyal to Kenshin also participated. Although most of the participants had perished in the void, there were still a few lucky survivors who managed to survive. These people had more or less the same experience hiding in the God world, changing their identities and struggling at death's door. 1,000 years had allowed them to recover from their injuries and recover more than half of their strength, but it did not extinguish the hope in their hearts, nor did it cool their blood. They had always believed that the sword god was immortal and would definitely make a comeback. They hid in various parts of the God world, hiding in the primal chaos mainland, silently recovering and accumulating power, waiting for the day they could take revenge. 1,000 years of waiting did not go to waste. Now Kenshin had returned to the God world, and with an invincible attitude he had conquered 3 continents. When the news of Kenshin's arrival in the primal chaos mainland spread, those old subordinates who had been hiding in various places all came to pay their respects to Kenshin. Seeing Limitless Sword Chief enter the underground palace, everyone was stunned for a moment, then they all revealed gratified and excited smiles. Everyone stood up to welcome him, and with the most sincere expressions and words, they welcomed Limitless Sword Chief's return. Comrades who had gone through life and death together reunited. Naturally they were full of emotions and had endless words to say and endless thoughts to share. The tranquil underground palace immediately became lively. In the study room after the Limitless Sword Leader entered the underground palace, Ji Tianqing sat back on the armchair and picked up the jade slip to handle some matters. He glanced at the door of the study casually, then waved his hand to close the door. With a bang, the door closed and the formation was activated. The domain lords and the leaders of the forces hiding in the dark could no longer find out what was going on in the study. Everyone was shocked. They quickly retreated and left the Chaos Divine Palace. With their intelligence, they could naturally guess that Kenshin had long since discovered them, but was just pretending not to see them. As for the last glance and the action of closing the door of the study, it was a reminder for them to leave. Now that the doubts of the domain lords and the leaders of the various forces had been resolved, of course, they tactfully retreated. Moreover, they had to pretend that they had never been here. As for them secretly spreading the news to the other domain lords and leaders of other forces, as long as they did it in secret, there wouldn't be a problem. All in all, the return of Kenshin's former subordinates was within everyone's expectations. Unknowingly, 20 days passed. The domain lords and the leaders of the various forces who had stayed behind to wait for the Kenshin to surrender and pledge their loyalty to them had basically all gathered. At the same time, more than 40 god kings of the Kenshin's former subordinates had also entered the Chaos Divine Palace and reunited with everyone. Of course, many of the god kings were former generals. On the surface they acted alone. In reality, they used some divine artifacts to bring dozens to hundreds of soldiers with them. These soldiers were either those who had stayed behind to guard the Heavenly Sword Mountain back then and did not participate in the great battle in outer space, or those who had experienced that great battle and survived by the skin of their teeth. Even though 1,000 years had passed, their loyalty and hot-bloodedness were still present. In these 1,000 years, everyone had endured humiliation and dragged out an ignoble existence, waiting for the day to come when they could take revenge. In this way, the number of former subordinates who had returned to the Kenshin had reached a total of more than 1,000. Perhaps there were still some former Kenshin subordinates who had been left behind and hidden in the god realm. They could not be contacted and did not come to the Chaos Divine Palace. But that should be a very small number. 90% of the former subordinates who had luckily survived back then should have returned to the army. Early in the morning, Ji Tianxing ordered 2 guard commanders to gather the various domain lords and leaders of the various factions to gather at the conference hall. More than 40 domain lords and a dozen or so leaders of top factions and ancient clans hurried over when they received the news. They had waited for so many days. Finally, they could pledge their loyalty to the Kenshin. Not long after, more than 60 powerhouses gathered in the conference hall. Next, it was Kenshin's turn to appear. Kenshin, surrounded by a group of god kings, stepped into the conference hall in a splendid robe. At this moment, everyone's gaze was focused on him. Oppressed by his powerful aura, everyone had the illusion that Kenshin was surrounded by a golden halo. It was so dazzling that no one dared to look directly at him. Naturally, everyone's gaze was focused on the dozen or so god kings behind Kenshin. There were many domain lords and faction leaders who recognized those god king experts and could identify them. Among them there were 3 sword chiefs, 3 god generals and the 4 cardinal god kings. They were all top experts in the past and had great reputations. Under the escort of these experts, Ji Tianxing ascended to the throne of the leader. Thus, the dozens of god kings in the conference hall bowed in unison and said, "Greetings, Kenshin." After everyone bowed, Ji Tianxing began to announce the official business. It was another impassioned, righteous and majestic opening speech. He expressed his determination and attitude to save the common people and subdue the chaotic mainland. After that, he thanked the various domain lords, factions and ancient clans for their support and righteousness on behalf of the common people. Of course, these were all pleasantries that everyone was well aware of. It was just a formality. Next, it was the turn of the various domain lords and faction leaders to swear their loyalty. That was the official business. In any case, everyone was already mentally prepared. They had crossed thousands of mountains and rivers to come to the chaotic paradise for this matter. No one dared to raise any objections or discuss any conditions with Ji Tianxing. The matter was relatively simple. Ji Tianxing directly waved his hand and shot out a white light, displaying the specific content of the pledge of surrender in the conference hall. The content of the vow, which was over 1,000 words long, made everyone in the conference hall tremble with fear. Their faces turned pale and cold sweat broke out on their foreheads. However, the general trend was irreversible. No one dared to shrink back. In addition, everyone had already heard of the rumors regarding the heavenly Dao oath, so they were already mentally prepared. In the end, under the lead of some of the domain lords and clan leaders, everyone began to publicly swear the pledge of surrender. Chapter 4361. To Ji Tianxing, this was not the first time he had made so many godly kings swear allegiance to him. Even though the scene looked very sacred and solemn and the scale was a little grand, he was used to it. But to the dozens of godly kings who had sworn allegiance to him, this was the first time they had experienced something like this. Dozens of godly kings, all of whom were powerful figures of their own regions, were gathered here, but they were willing to swear such a harsh oath of allegiance. But no one dared to refuse and no one dared to resist or resent them. In fact, many people who wanted to show their loyalty had to show a positive and proud state. Such a scene was naturally very shocking. Everyone felt a strong sense of reverence in their hearts. Finally, after 7 minutes, everyone finished swearing their allegiance. Everyone's body lit up with divine light, and a trace of Daoist rhyme appeared above their heads. In the sky above the chaotic divine palace, a series of deafening muffled thunder boomed. Such a sacred and solemn scene, coupled with the invisible power of the heavenly Tao, made many godly kings tremble with fear. They could clearly sense that the oath to the heavenly Tao had been established. From this moment on, the heavens were watching them, monitoring their every move. From now on, they had to be loyal to Kenshin, and they could not do anything that harmed or went against the interests and orders of the Kenshin. Otherwise, they would be severely punished by the heavenly Tao. Under the solemn atmosphere, the entire conference hall was silent. The dozens of godly kings lowered their heads, trying hard to calm their emotions. As for the old subordinates of Kenshin, those sword chiefs, godly generals, and godly kings silently watched all of this, and a deep sense of pride welled up in their hearts. Look, our Lord Kenshin is back. Not only is he back, but he is even stronger than before, even more sacred and dignified. Our Lord Kenshin is the embodiment of justice, the spokesperson of the heavenly Tao. Even the heavens are helping us, so how can we not succeed in our revenge? After a long while, the muffled thunder that reverberated between heaven and earth dissipated. The solemn atmosphere in the conference hall also began to fade away. At this time, Ji Tianxing announced the appointments of the many experts. Those who were originally domain lords would naturally retain their original positions. At the same time, after today's meeting, they had to rush back to their respective territories as soon as possible to abolish slavery and return freedom to the people. More than 40 territorial lords remained in their original positions, but there were still more than 50 vacant territorial lord positions. This was also the question that the experts present were most concerned about. Ji Tianxing had also secretly observed everyone in the past 20 days. He already had an answer in his heart. He publicly announced that the leaders of the dozen or so forces and the patriarchs of the ancient clans who had come to pledge their allegiance would be appointed as the realm masters of certain regions. Under normal circumstances, those forces and clans would only let them take up the position of domain lord in the area closest to them if there was a vacancy. Ji Tianxing had arranged for 19 experts to serve as the new territorial lords. However, there were still more than 30 regions that were still empty. Thus, Ji Tianxing allowed the territorial lords of the surrounding regions to temporarily hold the position of territorial lord and manage it on his behalf. Ever since the 5 god emperors ruled over the god realm 1,000 years ago, no one had been able to rule over 2 regions at once. Ji Tianxing had no choice but to set this precedent. In any case, those territorial lords who were in charge of 2 regions were only temporary replacements. In the future, when he encountered suitable candidates, Ji Tianxing would make adjustments again. In this way, the territorial lords of over 100 regions were settled. Next, these experts would carry out a series of orders to abolish slavery, restore the freedom of the people, and pacify the chaos in the various regions. Many of the territorial lords bowed to show their obedience, but they were somewhat puzzled. There were so many vacant territorial lord positions, so why didn't Kenshin appoint his old subordinates? For example, those sword chiefs, divine generals and divine kings were clearly qualified to take up the position of territorial lord. Why didn't Kenshin mention them? Many people were puzzled. However, there were also a few territorial lords and experts who guessed Kenshin's thoughts. It was likely that Kenshin was unwilling to leave his old subordinates in the chaotic mainland to take up the position of territorial lord and deal with those mundane affairs all day long. In comparison, Kenshin would rather take his old subordinates to continue fighting and take revenge on the 5 god emperors in the future. This was indeed the case. A few days ago, Ji Tianxing had talked to the generals and experts under his command and asked for their opinions. If they were willing to stay, Ji Tianxing could arrange for them to take up the position of territorial lord or guard the chaotic grotto heaven. This way they would have a stable life for the rest of their lives and would no longer have to fight and kill. However, those generals and experts all rejected his good intentions without exception. They all said that they wanted to follow him to take revenge on the 5 god emperors. Ji Tianxing could only agree to their strong requests, so he didn't arrange any positions for them. After the various territorial lords bid farewell and left, only Ji Tianxing and his old subordinates were left in the chaotic grotto heaven, as well as the servants and guards from before. At this time, Ji Tianxing began to recruit soldiers and horses again, forming the Imperial Guard to guard the chaotic grotto heaven. Those over 1,000 guards began to get busy again, faithfully carrying out his orders. A few sword chiefs, divine generals and divine kings also led their subordinates to carry out the various orders. Although the matter of the 100 territorial lords had been temporarily resolved, Ji Tianxing could appoint new territorial lords in the future, and it would be completely resolved. However, he was destined to leave the chaotic continent, so he had to have trusted subordinates to stay behind and control the overall situation. The chaotic grotto heaven also needed at least 10,000 imperial guards to guard it, and these all needed to be gradually expanded. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing had enough old subordinates under his command. He only needed to plan and issue orders for these matters and didn't need to do it himself. However, this matter couldn't be done overnight. It needed some time. Ji Tianxing could only guard the chaotic grotto heaven and wait patiently. Within a few days, news began to spread on the chaotic continent. Some regions closer to the chaotic grotto heaven had already released news that they had begun to abolish slavery and return freedom to the people. After the news spread, it naturally attracted countless cheers and applause, causing the people's admiration for Kenshin to reach the peak. Following that, more and more regions began to implement the new policies and restore the freedom of the people. Especially those new territorial lords, after simply taking office, they began to use the forces under their command to efficiently implement the new policies. As time passed, the entire chaotic continent fell into a carnival. Those people who regained their freedom might not be grateful to those territorial lords, but they were extremely grateful to Kenshin. In many cities, the people spontaneously built temples and erected statues of Kenshin. Every day there were people who went to worship in an endless stream. On the other side, the recruitment of the Imperial Guard in the chaotic grotto heaven was completed in half a month. Chapter 4362. Actually, there were many quick-witted people who had been paying attention to the chaos grotto heaven. When they learned that Xianxia had led tens of thousands of soldiers and many domain lords to escape from the divine world, they realized that the chaos grotto heaven's power was lacking. After Kenshin took over the chaos grotto heaven, he would definitely subdue some factions or recruit soldiers to strengthen the defense of the chaos grotto heaven. After all, it was the center of power of the entire chaos mainland. There had to be a large number of imperial guards to protect it. For a long time, many experts and factions had been thinking about this matter. Therefore, when the chaos grotto heaven announced that it was recruiting imperial guards, a large number of Divine Lord experts immediately rushed to sign up. To become an Imperial Guard, one had to fulfill a basic requirement. That was to have the strength of a high-level Divine Lord. Even the most ordinary Imperial Guard soldier had to have the strength of a level 7 Divine Lord. If one wanted to be a captain or commander in the Imperial Guard, one had to be a Divine King expert. A lower Divine King could be a captain of the Imperial Guard, but the commander had to be a level 6 Divine King. Of course, out of the tens of thousands of experts who signed up for the Imperial Guard test, only 8,000 passed. In addition, there were already more than 1,000 guards in the Chaos Grotto Heaven. Together they formed 10,000 Imperial Guards. All the Imperial Guards needed to read a simple pledge of surrender to ensure their loyalty to the God of Swords. Especially the Imperial Guard captains and commanders. The oath they recited was more detailed and strict. In this way, the loyalty of the Imperial Guards was guaranteed. All that was left was long-term training to hone their teamwork and cooperation. There were only a little more than 1,000 servants and maids left in the Chaos Grotto Heaven. Under the advice of the 2 Imperial Guard commanders, Ji Tianxing recruited another 1,000 people to serve as servants and maids. 3,000 servants and maids, 10,000 Imperial Guards. This was enough to ensure the normal operation of the Chaos Grotto Heaven. The most important problem was for Ji Tianxing to solve. Soon he would leave the Chaos mainland. Who would take over the authority and control the entire mainland? Ji Tianxing's old subordinates, the sword chiefs, divine generals and divine kings, were all unwilling to stay. These people were not greedy for power. They would rather follow Ji Tianqing into the void and seek revenge from the 5 god emperors. Therefore, Ji Tianqing could only choose one or a few experts from the primal chaos continent to take over. The top forces and leaders of the ancient clans who had sided with him had all pledged their loyalty to him. However, these people could only be used as alternatives. Unless it was absolutely necessary, Ji Tianqing would rather choose people he approved of. For example, Tang Yi, Lei Zhensong and Lei Zhenqiang had been loyal to him since 1,000 years ago. That year, Tang Yi was the patriarch of the Tang family, an ancient family. He was a 9th king god realm expert who was good at hiding, tracking, assassinating and disguising. The Tang family was one of the ancient clans loyal to the Kenshin. When the War of the Gods broke out, Tang Yi led more than 2,000 elites of the Tang family to follow the Kenshin out into the void. The result was self-evident. Kenshin fell and the blood of the Tang family's disciples spilled in the void. Almost all of them were wiped out. Tang Yi was heavily injured, losing an arm and a leg. He was forcefully sent out of the battlefield by a Tang family elder at the cost of self-detonation. Only then did he survive. For the next 1,000 years, Tang Yi lived in seclusion on the primal chaos continent. While silently healing his injuries, he held on to the last glimmer of hope, waiting for revenge. This time, the news of Kenshin's conquest of the primal chaos continent had spread. Tang Yi traveled across land and water, disregarding everything to pay a visit to Kenshin. Although he vowed to follow Ji Tianqing out of the primal chaos continent and go to the depths of the void to seek revenge from the 5 god emperors. However, Ji Tianqing always felt that Tang Yi was someone who had already died for him once. Tang Yi had ended up in such a miserable state, and he could not let the same thing happen again. He wanted Tang Yi to stay and take control of the primal chaos continent. Lei Zhensong and Lei Zhenqiang were twin brothers. At the same time, they were also the left and right protectors of the Lei family 1,000 years ago. The Lei family was also one of the ancient clans that were loyal to Kenshin. Back then, the Lei family's patriarch had led over 2,000 elite disciples to follow Kenshin into the void. But in the end, the Lei family's patriarch and all the disciples died tragically in the void, turning into ashes. Only the 2 brothers, Lei Zhensong and Lei Zhenqiang, were lucky enough to survive after paying a terrible price. Their divine bodies suffered permanent injuries. Even if they were incomplete, they could not be repaired. For the past 1,200 years, they changed their surnames, disguised themselves, and lived in seclusion in a remote place. Only then were they able to survive. After learning that Kenshin had returned to the divine world and conquered the primal chaos continent, they rushed to the primal chaos grotto heaven to meet Kenshin. The fate of these 2 brothers was somewhat similar to Tang Yi's. Therefore, Ji Tianqing planned to let them stay and assist Tang Yi in managing the primal chaos continent. Unknowingly, 2 months passed. The new policies of over 100 regions were implemented. The commoners regained their freedom and a new life. The atmosphere was still jubilant. Ji Tianqing saw the abilities and performance of the various domain masters clearly and remembered them in his heart. Overall, every domain master was conscientious and did not dare to slack off. This made him rather satisfied. At the same time, many powerhouses and factions also emerged in the dozens of regions where the domain master position was vacant. They actively performed. Under the guidance of some domain masters and powerhouses, those God King powerhouses and leaders of top factions expressed their loyalty to Ji Tianqing one after another. After careful consideration, Ji Tianqing screened the various powerhouses and factions. In the end, he selected over 30 powerhouses to fill the vacant domain master position. Just like this, over 100 domain masters of the primal chaos continent were gathered. Furthermore, every domain master swore their loyalty to Ji Tianqing. The primal chaos grotto heaven's defense situation was also completed under Ji Tianqing's command and arrangement. The overall situation was set. Ji Tianqing prepared to appoint the new domain master. Therefore, he secretly summoned Tang Yi, Lei Zhensong, and Lei Zhenqiang and expressed his intentions to the 3 of them. When the 3 of them learned that they had to stay in the primal chaos continent, control the power, and manage the entire continent, they rejected without hesitation. Although they knew that this was Kenshin's good intentions, the hatred in their hearts was too deep. However, the hatred buried deep in their hearts was too deep. No matter what, they had to find the 5 great god emperors to take revenge. Ji Tianqing could only persuade them earnestly and patiently explain to them. Although revenge was important, guarding the few continents of the God realm and firmly controlling the God realm in their hands was of the utmost importance. With the current situation in the primal chaos continent, he could no longer find someone he could trust with enough ability to manage the entire continent. Therefore, this heavy responsibility could only be handed to the three of them. The master and servant four discussed in secret in the study for an entire night. In the end, the three god kings could only choose to give in and accept Ji Tianqing's appointment. Chapter 43-63. After deciding that Tang Yi, Lei Zhensong and Lei Zhenqiang would be in charge of the primal chaos mainland, Ji Tianqing announced to the world. From today onwards, the three of them would oversee the primal chaos grotto heaven and manage the entire primal chaos mainland. 10,000 imperial guards, over 100 domain lords, and many top forces and ancient clans would be under their control. Although the three of them were not the strongest in the primal chaos mainland, and their injuries were difficult to heal, their battle strength was greatly reduced. But everyone knew that they were Kenshin's most trusted and most loyal right-hand men. When Kenshin left the primal chaos mainland, they would be Kenshin's representatives. Those imperial guards, domain lords and experts of the top forces and clans had already sworn an oath of allegiance, so how would they dare to defy Tang Yi and the other two? Although there were still some forces and sects on the primal chaos mainland, as well as a few ancient clans, they maintained a neutral attitude and did not swear allegiance to Kenshin. But these sects and clans were well aware that unless they were tired of living, they could only behave themselves and not cause any trouble. If they did anything out of line, they would have to face over 100 domain lords, many top forces, sects and clans. At that time there would be no need for Kenshin to make a move. Those experts who swore allegiance to Kenshin would be able to wipe them out completely. Simply put, the primal chaos mainland was completely under Kenshin's control. Other than the 5 god emperors, no one else had the strength to take away Kenshin's control. After announcing Tang Yi and the other two's appointment, Ji Tianqing stayed in the primal chaos grotto heaven for a month. In this month he brought Tang Yi and the other two into the distorted spacetime and used wonderful divine abilities and a huge amount of cultivation resources to treat their injuries. With the help of the blood flame sacred tree, Ji Tianqing's treatment of their injuries became much easier and the progress was very fast. A month had passed in the outside world, but Tang Yi and the other two had stayed in the distorted spacetime for more than 4 years. After 4 years of treatment, their old injuries had basically healed and their strength had recovered by 80%. Even if he was like Tang Yi who was missing an arm or a leg, Ji Tianqing could easily take care of him. Just like how he had helped the blood illusion god monarch in the past, he had taken a branch from the blood flame sacred tree and refined it into Tang Yi's arm to complete his divine body. After all, Tang Yi was the ruler and overlord of the primal chaos continent. If he lost an arm or a leg, it would affect his image. Of course, maintaining a dignified image was only part of the reason. Most importantly, Tang Yi's injuries had recovered by 80%. His divine body had been mended, and his strength had also reached 90% of his peak condition. In the future, after hundreds or thousands of years of recuperation, it might not be impossible for him to return to his peak. A month later, Tang Yi and the other two left the distorted space-time, officially taking over the Chaos Grotto Heaven and the entire continent. Next, they would have a lot of things to deal with and they might be busy for many years. After all, only the overall situation of the Primal Chaos continent had stabilized. There were still countless details and trivial matters to deal with. Tang Yi and the other two would naturally do their best to help Ji Tianqing manage the Primal Chaos mainland. On this point, Ji Tianqing would never worry. On a certain late night, he gathered Tang Yi and the other two and handed them a jade slip. That was the matter they had to deal with in the future. Ji Tianqing reminded the three of them, then bade them farewell and quietly left the Chaos Grotto Heaven. Tang Yi and the other two would definitely keep it a secret and not leak Ji Tianqing's whereabouts. Everyone in the divine world knew that after Kenshin subdued the Primal Chaos mainland, only Qiankuan continent was left, waiting to be occupied by Kenshin. Even though everyone knew that Kenshin would definitely head to Qiankuan continent after leaving the Primal Chaos mainland. But when he would go, it was hard to determine. For nearly a year, Qiankuan continent had been paying attention to Kenshin's movements. Ever since Kenshin subdued Reincarnation Island, the rulers of Qiankuan continent had been on high alert, guarding against Kenshin's sudden attack. After all, Reincarnation Island was in the middle of the divine world, very close to any continent. Most importantly, the ruler of Qiankun continent was the Nine Suns God Emperor Lu Zhiyang. Many years ago, Ji Tianxing had fought with Lu Zhiyang's incarnation in the void and destroyed it. Since Lu Zhiyang's incarnation was long gone, there was no way his original body would give up on the mystery of the gray fog in the void. In that case, Qiankun continent had lost its strongest backer. When Kenshin attacked, the rulers had no one to rely on and could only think of ways to save themselves. Now, the ruler of Qiankun continent was the Eight-Eyed Divine King, a new peak divine king 1,000 years ago and Lu Zhiyang's first disciple. Under the Eight-Eyed Divine King's command, there were 2 guardians, 3 marshals for governors and more than 60 divine generals. More than 100 territorial lords were under his command, and more than 100,000 elites served him, including 20,000 imperial guards. In addition, there were more than 30 top sects and ancient clans that were also loyal to the Nine Suns God Emperor and obeyed the Eight-Eyed Divine King's orders. In summary, when Kenshin attacked Qiankun continent, the Eight-Eyed Divine King could gather 100,000 elites and more than 300 Divine King experts to fight against Kenshin with all his might. Logically speaking, the Eight-Eyed Divine King had such a strong military force that even without the help of the Nine Suns God Emperor, he could still contend with Kenshin and even have a chance to kill Kenshin. But this was only an ideal situation and even an unrealistic fantasy. The miserable fates of the rulers and soldiers of the 4 continents had been repeated and ample proof of Kenshin's strength and methods. No matter how few men Kenshin had under his command, he could always create miracles, using schemes and all sorts of methods to mercilessly crush his enemies. Therefore, when news of the Prajna God Emperor's avatar being destroyed and Kenshin subduing the primal chaos continent spread, Qiankun continent immediately panicked. Before the Prajna God Emperor's avatar clashed with Kenshin, the Eight-Eyed Divine King still had a glimmer of hope and hope. Now that his hopes were completely dashed, he no longer dared to hope for a fluke. He immediately gave up on defending Qiankun continent and fighting Kenshin to the bitter end. He knew very well that Kenshin would reach Qiankun continent in 2 or 3 months at most. Whether to flee or fight, he had to make a decision quickly. He quickly sent a message to the Nine Suns God Emperor and asked for instructions from his master. The Nine Suns God Emperor was naturally filled with shock and anger, but in the end, it all turned into a helpless sigh. In order to preserve his strength, the Nine Suns God Emperor could only agree to the Eight-Eyed Divine King's request and allow him to lead his troops away, temporarily abandoning Qiankun continent. With his master's permission, the Eight-Eyed Divine King no longer felt any pressure. He quickly issued a secret order to gather the top forces, domain lords and experts loyal to him and the Nine Suns God Emperor. At the same time, his trusted generals began to wantonly plunder resources, moving their treasuries and assets, preparing to flee. After a month of careful preparation, 50,000 elite soldiers finally gathered in the Qiankun Grotto Heaven and retreated with the Eight-Eyed Divine King. Chapter 4364. When Ji Tianxing left the primal chaos mainland, there was no news of him leaving. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship and flew across the sky at lightning speed. Those following him were still the same group of people. Including Nangong Ao and his followers, there were only about 30 people and they were all God King experts. Even though Ji Tianxing didn't have any foundation in the Qiankun continent, he wasn't worried at all. After reaching the Qiankun continent, he would subdue some factions and recruit a group of God King experts before dealing with the Eight-Eyed Divine King. Before he left the primal chaos mainland, he had asked his soldiers to gather information about the Qiankun continent. Although he only knew the general situation, it was enough for him to make a judgment. According to his previous plan, there wouldn't be any problems. After all, the Nine Suns God Emperor's incarnation had already been destroyed by him. The Nine Suns God Emperor's original body couldn't return to the God world. Even though the Eight-Eyed Divine King was a peak God King and could gather 100,000 elite soldiers, there was nothing to be afraid of. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship towards the Qiankun continent at a moderate speed. From the time the battleship left the primal chaos grotto heaven, it would take about a month for them to reach the Qiankun continent. During this period, Ji Tianxing cultivated in seclusion in the distorted spacetime and continued to raise his strength. Previously in the primal chaos mainland, he defeated the Prajna God Emperor's incarnation and killed many God King experts. He obtained many Godhead fragments and took the opportunity to refine them. Yun Yao, Jiku, and the rest went into seclusion to recover their strength as usual. The eight-eyed divine king had gathered all the territorial lords and soldiers in the heaven and earth grotto heaven in secret. However, this matter involved too many people, and a portion of the territorial lords and faction leaders chose to stay behind in the Qiankun continent after receiving his secret order. Therefore, the news of the eight-eyed divine king leading the soldiers to escape inevitably spread. Many factions and experts knew about it. If it was in the past, the eight-eyed divine king would definitely use force to suppress the news and prevent it from spreading. However, he was about to leave the Qiankun continent and couldn't care less. After a month of dispatching, waiting, and preparation, 50,000 soldiers gathered in the Heaven and Earth cave. They boarded dozens of divine warships and quietly left the Heaven and Earth continent. Among the 50,000 soldiers, there were not only the eight-eyed divine king's trusted generals, but also more than 30 domain lords, a dozen top forces, and ancient clans. In addition, he also took away 10,000 elite imperial guards, leaving only 6,000 servants and handymen in the Heaven and Earth cave, as well as more than 1,000 weaker and older imperial guards. The 50,000 soldiers that the eight-eyed God King took away were all elites that he had handpicked. He wasn't just running away. Instead, he was transferring these elite troops to the outskirts of the realm to serve the Nine God Emperor. Along with this fleet leaving the Qiankun continent, there were also cultivation resources and wealth worth more than 1 trillion. It was the wealth that the eight-eyed God King had accumulated over the past few decades. It was also the wealth that the eight-eyed God King had accumulated over the past few decades. With such abundant cultivation resources, it was enough for the 50,000 soldiers to survive in the void for thousands of years. It had been half a month since the eight-eyed deity king had left Qiankun mainland. News of the eight-eyed deity king's escape had already spread throughout the Qiankun mainland. The entrance to the Heaven and Earth cave had been closed. The 6,000 servants, handymen, and imperial guards were holed up in the Heaven and Earth cave. They didn't show themselves or escape. The reason why they closed the entrance was because they were afraid that some clans, top forces, and experts would take the opportunity to attack the Heaven and Earth cave. The reason why they stayed in the Heaven and Earth cave and didn't escape was because they had heard some news and knew what had happened in the Chaos Cave. As long as they waited patiently and sincerely surrendered to Kenshin when they saw him, Kenshin wouldn't kill them. Instead, he would let them stay and continue working in the Heaven and Earth cave. After all, they would be servants to anyone. Even if they changed masters, as long as their situation didn't change. Reality proved that the 6,000 imperial guards, servants, and handymen had made a wise decision. It had only been a few days since the eight-eyed God King left the Qiankun mainland with his fleet, but the Qiankun mainland was already in chaos. As the saying goes, when the tiger is absent, the monkey becomes king. The eight-eyed God King took away many God King experts, including more than 30 territorial lords. Those 30 territorial lords were the first to erupt into chaos. The emperors of the various empires and the God King experts of the top forces began to fight for the position of territorial lord. These experts had studied the process of Kenshin conquering the various continents and knew that Kenshin wouldn't kill the innocent. As long as they obediently expressed their obedience and loyalty after Kenshin arrived at the Qiankun mainland, not only would they be able to keep their lives, they would also be able to retain their power and status. Before Kenshin arrived at the Qiankun mainland, it didn't matter what they did. Anyone with a bit of ambition wouldn't let go of such an excellent opportunity. The Qiankun mainland had been peaceful for thousands of years. Even if those experts and forces wanted to dominate an area and split up their territories, they didn't dare to do so. This time they wanted to do their best to conquer territories and seize the position of territorial lord. As long as they could seize more territories and power before Kenshin arrived, they would be able to make the final decision once Kenshin arrived and they swore their allegiance. Therefore, those 30 territorial lords were the most chaotic. Various forces fought and countless experts came out of seclusion to kill each other, setting off a bloodbath. The other 60 territorial lords weren't as crazy as the 30 territorial lords, but they were still in chaos. Even though there were still territorial lords in these territorial lords, they weren't much of a threat. The top forces and God King experts of the various territorial lords used to fear and respect the territorial lords because of the eight-eyed God King and nine-sun God Emperor. When the entire continent was at peace, they wouldn't dare to rebel or they'd be killed mercilessly. But now, Those with power, influence, and ambition were naturally unwilling to be left out. Some experts of the territorial lords tried to kill off the original territorial lords and replace them. In any case, there were more or less conflicts and grudges between them and the domain master, so they could take advantage of this opportunity to resolve them. Of course, most of the territorial lords and experts still didn't dare to start a war with the territorial lords who had thousands of years of history. They chose to take revenge for their grievances and start a war with other forces and enemies. Then they could take revenge or annex the other party. Even many divine kingdoms and empires had launched large-scale wars because of national enmity. Wars between kingdoms often involved tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of troops, affecting many cities and prefectures and millions of civilians. If the wars were less chaotic and small in scale, the territorial lords could still send troops to suppress and stop them. But within a territorial lord's territory, there was nothing he could do. He could only do his best and leave the rest to fate. As for the civilians, they hated the current nobles and hoped that Kenshin would arrive at the Qianquan mainland and save them from this disaster. Chapter 4365. In just a month, the Qianquan continent was in a mess, ravaged by the flames of war. Almost every region had experienced chaos and was ravaged by war and killing, causing countless gods to die and the people to become homeless. According to incomplete statistics, there were close to 10,000 wars and large-scale killings in the hundreds of regions of the Qianquan continent. At least 30 million gods had participated in the wars and killings, and close to 10 million gods had died in battle. The number of civilians who were affected by the war, injured, destroyed, and suffered heavy losses was more than 1 billion. Of course, these were all rough figures. There was no way to calculate the specific numbers. Even after Ji Tianqing took control of the Qianquan continent, he could not get a precise result. In addition, in the month-long chaos, a few things happened that had a bigger impact. After a month of fighting, 28 out of the 30 or so regions with vacant territorial lords had emerged victorious with their new territorial lords. The forces of the remaining 8 regions were still fighting, and there was no time to determine the winner. More than 10 domain lords had been killed or defeated by the top forces or ancient clans in the 60 or so domain lords, losing their positions as domain lords. In addition, after a month of fighting, countless forces and experts changed the power structure of the Qianquan continent. Originally, there were 42 top forces on the continent. Now there were only 32 left. Those 10 forces were either swallowed up or destroyed. There were 27 ancient clans in the Qianquan continent. Now there were only 23 left. 4 ancient clans were destroyed. This 1 month was still a little short for those experts and forces who were fighting and fighting. It was not enough for them to achieve their goals, eliminate their enemies and occupy more territories. However, to the people of the Qianquan continent, this 1 month was too long. It was simply endless torture. Especially those civilians who were affected by the flames of war. They felt incomparably tormented. Every day felt like a year and they were on tenterhooks every day. Fortunately, Lord Kenshin, whom billions of people had been waiting for, had finally arrived. A month had just passed, and the god-slaying battleship arrived at the Qianquan continent as scheduled. When entering the Qianquan continent, Bai Long was very cautious. He had the god-slaying battleship remain invisible and hide its aura. He knew very well that the eyes of the entire god realm were gathered here. Everyone knew that Kenshin would definitely conquer Qianquan continent in the near future. The 8-eyed God King would definitely be extremely vigilant, and would do his best to intercept and obstruct him. However, after the god-slaying battleship entered the Qianquan continent, White Dragon discovered that the scene before him was completely different from what he had imagined. There was no tense atmosphere of fear and trepidation, nor was there a solemn scene of a large number of troops on standby. In fact, they did not even have a large number of scouts and spies to search and monitor the abnormal situation. It was no exaggeration to say that the Qianquan continent was completely defenseless. No one would stop the god-slaying battleships from entering and leaving. This surprised the White Dragon. He thought to himself, what is the 8-eyed divine king doing? How could the Qianquan continent be so lax and defenseless? Could it be that that fellow knows that Shizuan's divine might is unstoppable? So he simply stopped resisting and waited to surrender? The White Dragon felt that this was very likely. After all, the incarnation of the 9 Suns God Emperor had already been destroyed by his master. No matter how many soldiers the 8-eyed God King could gather, it would be useless. After flying towards the center of the Qianquan continent for 2 days, the White Dragon discovered some problems. Along the way, the few regions they passed seemed to be in chaos. He saw many homeless and fleeing people as well as many gods who were covered in wounds and in miserable states. He even personally witnessed a few great battles as well as a few wars between god nations. With the White Dragon's intelligence, he immediately realized that there was a problem here. Under normal circumstances, with the eight-eyed god king overseeing the Qianquan continent, even if the rulers were afraid of Kenshin, they would still be able to maintain stability. At the very least, there would not be chaos or war in the various regions of the Qianquan continent. The eight-eyed god king could not fight against Kenshin, but could he not suppress the factions of the various regions in those small god nations? Since the various regions were in chaos and there were wars and killings between god nations, this could only mean one thing. The eight-eyed god king could very likely have given up on the Qianquan continent and fled the god world with a large number of soldiers and resources, just like God King Crimson Afterglow. Having guessed this, the White Dragon immediately reported the news to his master for him to make a decision. Ji Tianxing had been cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime. In the month that the god-slaying battleship traveled, he had been in seclusion for more than 4 years. During the great battle in the Primal Chaos continent, he had obtained more than 100 pieces of godhood fragments, and had finished refining all of them. The result was indisputable. His strength had increased by a few %. The current him already possessed 60 times the strength of an ordinary peak god king. After hearing the White Dragon's report, he ended his cultivation, left the distorted spacetime, and appeared in the god-slaying battleship. After the White Dragon described in detail what he had seen, Ji Tianxing agreed with his judgment. He believed that the eight-eyed god king could have escaped. In order to confirm this conjecture, Ji Tianxing had the White Dragon pilot the battleship and land near a city. In the south of the city there were 2 groups of experts fighting. There were more than 1,000 people on both sides, belonging to 2 sections. The leaders were both god kings and the participants were all elite god monarchs. Ji Tianxing did not hide his whereabouts. When the 2 sides were engaged in a fierce battle, he appeared and sealed off the surrounding 10,000 miles with a ray of divine light, suppressing everyone with his supreme divine might. The people of the 2 sects were scared out of their wits. They quickly stopped fighting, trembling, and looked at Ji Tianxing with fear. Ji Tianxing did not reveal his identity. He only asked the 2 sides why they were fighting. What was the current situation in the Qianquan continent? Why was it so chaotic? The experts of the 2 sects were shocked by Ji Tianxing's divine might. Although they did not know his identity, they were afraid of his strength. They could only tell him the truth. As Ji Tianxing expected, the eight-eyed god king had already escaped with tens of thousands of soldiers. Now the entire Qianquan continent was in chaos. The reason why the 2 sects were fighting was firstly to resolve their old grudges and secondly to fight for territory. After knowing the situation, Ji Tianxing pondered for a moment. He ordered both sides to stop fighting and gave them orders. He ordered the 2 sects to use all their strength to announce and spread a piece of news. Kenshin had arrived in the Qianquan continent. From now on, all forces were not to start any more wars and affect the common people. Anyone who disobeyed the order would be severely punished. The experts of the 2 sects were already guessing Ji Tianxing's identity. He was so powerful and he was very similar to the rumored Kenshin. Now that they heard Ji Tianxing's order, the people of the 2 sects were stunned. Chapter 4366. Kenshin. It's really Kenshin. No wonder he's so similar to the legendary Kenshin. Heavens, Kenshin really came and we even bumped into him? The experts from the 2 factions looked at each other, somewhat stunned and in disbelief. The shock of suddenly bumping into Kenshin even made them forget their hatred for each other. After a while, both sides came back to their senses and remembered Kenshin's orders. Neither side dared to be negligent and quickly mobilized all the forces they could to pass on Kenshin's orders. After they were done, the people from the 2 factions hurriedly bowed to Ji Tianxing and took the initiative to introduce themselves. Compared to the benefits of annexing the other party, of course, it was more important to curry favor with Kenshin and gain Kenshin's favor. However, Ji Tianxing was not interested in chatting with them. After asking about their identities and origins, he turned and left. The people from the 2 factions were not angry that they had asked for a snub. In fact, they felt that it was normal. With their strength and background, They were indeed not qualified to curry favor with Kenshin. They were not even area lords, and even area lords had to bow and scrape in front of Kenshin. After Kenshin left, the people from the two factions came back to their senses. Both sides faced each other with murderous intent, hesitating and weighing in their hearts. Should they continue to fight? Logically speaking, since Kenshin had already left, there should be no problem for them to continue to settle their grudges. However, Kenshin had just issued an order that from now on all factions and countries were to stop fighting, or they would be severely punished. The people from the two factions were very wary of this. They had long heard that Kenshin was the son of the heavens, the embodiment of justice, and even the power of the heavens was for him to use. The famous Oath of the Heavens, that shook the entire god realm, was the best example. Thus, the people from the two factions hesitated for a long time before finally choosing to back down. They glared fiercely at each other, threw out a bunch of harsh words and left one after another. Within a short 2 days, the news of Kenshin's arrival in the Qianquan continent spread throughout hundreds of regions. Although this was within everyone's expectations after the news spread, it still caused countless people to be shocked and cheered. This was especially true for the common people who had suffered and been ravaged by the flames of war. They were even more excited and felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. They had been waiting day and night, and finally the sword god had arrived. As long as the Kenshin arrives, the Qianquan continent will quickly regain its peace and tranquility. As expected, as the news of Kenshin's arrival in the Qianquan continent spread, another order issued by Kenshin was also spreading rapidly. Kenshin decrees that from this moment onwards, all factions and countries are not allowed to engage in war, nor are they allowed to harm innocent civilians. Otherwise, those who disobeyed would be severely punished. If it was anyone else, even if it was the eight-eyed God King, it might not have been much of a deterrent. After all, the Qianquan continent had hundreds of regions. It was vast and boundless. Even if many experts and factions were to engage in war, no one would be able to control them all. Even the eight-eyed God King, who controlled countless spies and secret conversations, might not be able to monitor every faction and every kingdom. However, this order was issued by Kenshin, so its deterrence was at its peak. Everyone knew that Kenshin had just arrived in the Qianquan continent and had yet to subdue factions and experts, so he did not have much manpower available. However, everyone in the continent had heard that Kenshin's heavenly oath was extremely harsh and terrifying. Anyone who made the heavenly oath would be monitored by the heavenly Dao. Once they broke the oath, they would be punished by the heavenly Dao. This meant that Kenshin was just as the rumors said. He was the embodiment of justice, the son of the heavenly Dao, and could control the power of the heavenly Dao. Under such circumstances, those factions and countries naturally did not dare to test the power of the heavenly Dao. Whether they were in the middle of a battle or about to fight, they all stopped fighting. Although there were very few factions and countries that did not stop fighting in time after receiving Kenshin's order, they still had some hope. There were also some forces that held on to a fluke mentality and continued to fight, so they were not punished by the heavens. However, these were the minority. Those factions that managed to avoid the heavenly Dao were grateful, but they did not dare to try again. Thus, the previously chaotic Qianquan continent immediately calmed down and regained its peace. Such a scene made the billions of citizens deeply feel how powerful Kenshin's deterrence was. No matter how chaotic the situation in the Qianquan continent was, Kenshin could still make the final decision. 7 days later, Zhou Xian boarded the god-slaying battleship and arrived at the Qianquan Grotto Heaven in the center of the Qianquan continent. Ever since the eight-eyed God King led his soldiers to escape, the entrance to the Qianquan Grotto Heaven had been closed for more than a month. The 6,000-plus imperial guards, servants and odd job workers had holed up in the Grotto Heaven and refused to show themselves. This was a wise move. It successfully allowed them to avoid the attacks of many experts and factions during this chaotic period. Now that Kenshin had arrived and revealed his identity at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven, the 6,000-plus imperial guards, servants and odd job workers opened the entrance excitedly as if they had seen their savior. Afterward, a few imperial guard commanders led 2,000 imperial guards to the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. They bowed to Zhou Xian and welcomed him into the Qianquan Grotto Heaven. Zhou Xian was not surprised by the reaction of the imperial guards. After receiving everyone's bow, he entered the Qianquan Grotto Heaven under the escort of several imperial guard commanders. The vast Qianquan grotto heaven was as peaceful as ever. The hundreds of palaces and mansions in the depths of the grotto heaven were also in perfect condition. They were clean and spotless. Back then, when the eight-eyed God King led his 50,000 soldiers to escape, the palaces and mansions were overturned. It was a mess. In the past month or so, it was the 6,000 imperial guards, servants and odd job workers who had stayed behind to tidy up and clean the palaces and mansions. In their minds, since they were going to welcome their new master Kenshin, they had to work hard and do their best to perform. Only by showing their loyalty and ability, and by showing character and value that Kenshin valued, could they be retained by Kenshin and continue to work in the Qianquan grotto heaven. As it turned out, Kenshin was quite satisfied with their performance. After entering the Qianquan grotto heaven, the Imperial Guard commanders briefed Kenshin on the current situation and took Kenshin to tour the various palaces and mansions. Along the way, everything was in order. The palaces, mansions, roads and squares were all clean and tidy. All the passageways and gates were guarded by Imperial guards. Servants and maids were on duty in every palace and mansion. But when they saw Kenshin, the Imperial guards all bowed and the servants and odd job workers all knelt and bowed respectfully. 2 hours later, Ji Tianxing finished listening to the Imperial Guard commander's reports and inspecting all the palaces and mansions. Then he returned to the conference hall and announced the acceptance of the 6,000 people. Chapter 4367. Before Ji Tianxing announced the acceptance of these Imperial Guards, servants and odd job workers, everyone was on tenterhooks and restless. When they heard Ji Tianxing's announcement, the Imperial Guard commanders heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly knelt down to thank him. Then Ji Tianxing waved his hand and shot out a ray of divine light, revealing the content of the heavenly oath. The Imperial Guard commanders were very tactful. They already knew the process of swearing allegiance to Kenshin. Without hesitation, they recited the oath on the spot. After the oath was made, the Imperial Guard commanders' bodies glowed with golden light. A wisp of Daoist rhyme circled above their heads. Muffled sounds of thunder could be heard from above the heavenly palace. Feeling the terrifying and divine pressure of the heavenly Tao, the Imperial Guard commanders were filled with fear. They were even more in awe of Ji Tianxing. After a long time, the heavenly Tao phenomenon and the terrifying heavenly Tao aura dissipated. The Imperial Guard commanders regained their senses. Ji Tianxing gave them another order and instructed them to do 2 things. The first thing was to publicly recruit the Imperial Guards to fill the gap in the defense of the universe grotto heaven. The second thing was to immediately convey Kenshin's order to inform the domain lords that Kenshin would immediately take over the universe continent. All the domain lords would be summoned to swear allegiance to him. Previously, when Ji Tianxing was in the chaotic mainland, he also went through the same process after he took over the Chaos Grotto Heaven. Therefore, the operation was smooth and methodical. After all, the universe continent did not fall apart, nor was it completely chaotic. As long as the domain lords were still around, Ji Tianxing only needed to subdue them and he would be able to subdue the entire continent. With Ji Tianxing's current reputation, it was inevitable that he would unify the entire God world. As long as he personally issued the order, the entire universe continent would not dare to disobey. For example, once the news of the Imperial Guards spread, there would definitely be a swarm of applicants. Who knew how many experts and powerhouses would rush to participate in the assessment? As for the domain lords coming to the universe grotto heaven to swear allegiance, Ji Tianxing was not worried at all that anyone would dare to disobey the order. Even if he didn't explain how those who disobeyed would be punished, everyone knew that disobeying Kenshin's orders would result in a miserable fate for the soldiers. The several imperial army marshals hurriedly bowed and left the conference hall to carry out the order. Ji Tianxing strolled around the divine palace alone. He went to check the eight-eyed deity king's study room, secret chambers, and treasury to see if there were any missing items or clues. Although this possibility was very small, he had nothing to do anyway. He had to figure out the structure of the divine palace and dig out all its secrets. After 3 days, Ji Tianxing figured out the structure and all the secrets of the heaven and earth cave. He knew exactly where the treasure trove was, where the secret chamber was, where the secret passage was, where the underground palace was. No matter how hidden it was, even if it was a double or triple hidden secret room, he would investigate it thoroughly. As it turned out, the eight-eyed divine king was indeed stingy. He took away all the valuable items. Moreover, before the eight-eyed divine king escaped, he had ample time to prepare. He cleaned up all the traces and clues and got Ji Tianqing to search the entire heaven and earth cave, but to no avail. Thus, Ji Tianqing returned to the secret chamber of the divine palace and entered the Jiutian 10 Absolutes pagoda to continue cultivating. Time passed day after day. Ji Tianqing's order had already spread to over 100 regions and was known by all the gods of the heaven and earth continent. Every day, a large number of monarch god experts would rush to the heaven and earth cave to sign up for the examination to become an imperial army guard. The examination was handled by 4 imperial army marshals. They were all lower god kings and had been imperial army marshals for over 1,000 years. They were very experienced in this matter. 4 ordinary imperial army guards, as long as they were upper god kings, they would be able to pass the examination. However, if they encountered god king experts who wanted to become imperial army marshals, the marshals would not be qualified to take the examination. They could only report the matter to Kenshin. Ji Tianqing could only spare some time to simply test the god kings and select a few of them. After the god kings swore their allegiance, they were appointed as the new imperial army marshals. Ji Tianqing's goal was to gather 10,000 imperial army guards, which meant that he needed 10 imperial army marshals. Currently, he had 2,000 imperial army guards and 4 imperial army marshals. He needed to recruit another 8,000 imperial army guards and 6 imperial army marshals. He originally thought that this matter would take a month to complete. Unexpectedly, there were so many experts who came to sign up that it was completed in just 10 days. 10 days later, the recruitment of the imperial army was completed. The 10 imperial army marshals and 10,000 imperial army guards began to practice to cultivate tacit understanding and discipline. At this time, some territorial lords came to attack the heaven and earth cave one after another. Different regions were close to the heaven and earth cave. Even if all the territorial lords rushed to the heaven and earth cave as soon as they received the order, there was still a big difference in the time they took to arrive. The fastest would arrive in a few days while the furthest would take a month. Ji Tianqing could only let the territorial lords who arrived first to stay in the heaven and earth cave to rest and wait patiently for everyone to arrive. Those territorial lords were obedient and didn't dare to show any impatience. They all stayed in the heaven and earth cave obediently. Of course, many quick-witted territorial lords took the initiative to greet Kenshin, trying to get close to him and improve their relationship. Unfortunately, Ji Tianqing had been cultivating in seclusion in the secret room and didn't meet with the territorial lords alone, which disappointed them. However, those territorial lords thought about it and felt that Kenshin's actions were right. At least it could ensure that Kenshin treated everyone fairly and justly. Only then would the masses be convinced. Even if everyone was forced by the heavenly oath to swear allegiance to Kenshin, they were still willing to do so. In addition to the territorial lords who rushed to the heaven and earth cave one after another, some mysterious experts also quietly arrived. No one knew the identities and origins of those mysterious experts. However, after they were brought into the heaven and earth cave by the imperial guards, they all quietly paid a visit to Kenshin. This scene made many territorial lords speculate in private. Of course, they didn't doubt Kenshin's fairness. They were just curious about the origins of those mysterious experts. Some territorial lords recalled what happened in the chaotic mainland. In particular, the people appointed by Kenshin to be in charge of the chaotic mainland were all his right-hand men back then. Therefore, the smarter territorial lords guessed that those mysterious experts were most likely Kenshin's subordinates back then. A month's time passed quickly. The 10 Imperial Guard commanders and 10,000 Imperial Guards also completed their initial run-in and practice. They looked rather solemn and serious. The heaven and earth cave also returned to its former appearance. There were many experts and it was quiet and solemn. Ji Tianqing cultivated in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for another 4 years, and his strength increased by a few points. Now his strength was more than 60 times that of an ordinary peak divine king. On the 32nd day, almost all the territorial lords were present. Early in the morning, Ji Tianqing walked out of the secret room and summoned everyone to meet in the conference hall. Chapter 4368. No one dared to disobey Kenshin's summons. Moreover, dozens of territorial lords arrived at the heaven and earth grotto heaven one after another. Many of them had been waiting for half a month and had been looking forward to this day. In just half an hour, all the territorial lords had gathered in the meeting hall. At this moment, Ji Tianxing strode into the hall with his head held high under the protection of 2 Imperial Guard commanders. For many of the territorial lords in the hall, it was their first time seeing Kenshin in person. When they saw Kenshin with their own eyes, they knew that the rumors were true. Kenshin was indeed wise and mighty, his aura sacred and majestic. Even if Kenshin did not purposely release his aura, it was enough to make people afraid and not dare to look directly at him. When Ji Tianxing walked to the throne, all the territorial lords bowed in unison and shouted, "Your subordinates greet Lord Kenshin." Even though they had not formally pledged their loyalty, they all considered themselves as Kenshin's subordinates and were very respectful. Ji Tianxing looked around the hall and nodded slightly, indicating for everyone to rise. Then he sat down on the throne at the head of the table. The territorial lords split into 2 rows and lined up neatly in the hall. Ji Tianxing looked around and found that there were only 88 territorial lords present. There were only 2 possibilities for this result. Either that or there were 12 districts that didn't have a territorial lord yet, and the position was still vacant. Either that or there were less than 12 empty domain lords, but some domain lords were not present. If it was the former, it would not be surprising. If it was the latter, then the nature of the situation was different. Kenshin had already entered the Heaven and Earth continent and issued a decree to summon all the territorial lords to the Heaven and Earth Grotto Heaven for a meeting. A month's time, no matter how far they were, was enough to cross half the continent. Thus, Ji Tianxing questioned this matter. His expression and tone were very dignified. When the 88 territorial lords saw Kenshin's anger, they were afraid and did not dare to make a sound. Only a few of the more experienced and respected domain lords dared to stand out and speak the truth. It turned out that the 12 territorial lords' positions were temporarily empty. Before the various factions could come to a conclusion, Kenshin arrived at the Qiankuan continent and issued an order to stop the war. Those forces were very unwilling, but they did not dare to disobey the Kenshin's orders and could only obediently stop fighting. After understanding this situation, Ji Tianxing's brows relaxed and his dignified expression eased a lot, greatly reducing the pressure on everyone. Next, each of the area lords stepped forward and introduced the basic situation of their respective areas. Ji Tianxing listened with a calm expression, memorizing the situation of each region. Although the domain master's reports were rather brief, he could still hear some problems from them and silently memorized them. 2 hours later, the 88 domain leaders finished their reports. Next, it was time for the long-awaited Oath of Allegiance. Ji Tianxing waved his hand and shot out a divine light, which formed a huge screen of light in mid-air, displaying the content of the Heavenly Dao Oath. The 88 domain leaders, according to the content on the screen, looked solemn as they read out the oath. Everyone's voices were quite orderly, converging into a torrential sound wave, shaking the entire hall. Since Ji Tianxing returned to the God Realm and conquered the 4 continents, he had heard of many oaths of allegiance. But before, every time they swore their allegiance, those domain leaders would tremble in fear, their expressions ugly, filled with regret, fear, and despair. Only this time 88 domain leaders swore in unison, and in such a majestic manner, sounding mighty and solemn. It was really rare. Even Ji Tianxing was a little surprised, carefully observing the expressions and reactions of those domain leaders. Only then did he see some clues. Obviously, those domain leaders did not read the contents of the oath carefully when they first began to read it. In order to show their loyalty and courage, they all read out the oath in a loud and majestic voice. But as they read, they felt that something was wrong. After carefully examining the contents of the oath, they found that the Heavenly Dao Oath was more terrifying than they had imagined, and harsher than the rumors said. Every domain leader's heart was trembling, and their hearts were filled with fear and regret. This could be seen from their subtle expressions and the changes in their eyes. But everyone was reading out the oath, and it was already impossible to stop halfway. If they stopped at this time or if their voices changed, Kenshin would definitely notice. By then they would definitely leave a bad impression on Kenshin. Not to mention whether they would be punished, they would definitely have no future. So, every domain leader was terrified, but they could only force themselves to keep their voices loud and clear, not even daring to change their tone. Such a comical scene lasted for a full 15 minutes before it ended. No one dared to stop midway and did not dare to miss a single word. Everyone finished reciting the Heavenly Dao Oath. So, everyone's body lit up with divine light, and a trace of Daoist rhyme appeared above their heads. Right above the heavenly palace, deafening thunder also sounded in the sky. An invisible heavenly might enveloped the 88 domain leaders, causing everyone to be filled with fear, and they could not help but lower their heads. Such a powerful phenomenon of heaven and earth lasted for a long time before it dissipated. In the silent and solemn hall, a full 15 minutes passed before the atmosphere gradually eased. All the domain leaders personally experienced the terror of the heavenly might, and their respect for Ji Tianxing grew. They could even feel that the heavens were like a pair of invisible eyes, constantly monitoring them and watching their every move. If they did anything that went against the Kenshin's interests or disrespected the Kenshin, they would immediately be punished by the heavens. Everyone secretly swore in their hearts that no matter what, they would not betray Kenshin. Even if they could not gain Kenshin's favor, they would not violate their oath and be punished by the heavens. Since the oath of allegiance was over, Ji Tianxing did not waste any time and immediately gave everyone orders. As usual, he ordered every domain leader to abolish slavery as soon as possible and restore the freedom of the slaves. In addition, they had to implement his new policies and ensure the freedom and peace of the common people to the greatest extent. Of course, the remaining forces under the Eight-Eyed Divine King, as well as some forces that refused to surrender, had to be eliminated as soon as possible. Finally, the 12 territories that didn't have a territorial lord would need the surrounding territorial lords to gather detailed information about them. Ji Tianxing wanted to investigate the forces within each domain that were qualified to compete for the position of domain leader, and finally select a domain leader after careful consideration and selection. To put it simply, there was no need for those forces and experts to fight each other anymore, and Kenshin would personally select the domain leader. In this way, it was no longer a matter of who had the most power or who had the highest cultivation level to become the domain leader. Ji Tianxing did not select the domain leader based only on strength, but also on other factors. For example, character, ability, efficiency, and so on. In regards to this matter, the 40 or so domain leaders around the 12 domains all nodded and said that they understood. The 46 domain leaders were all required to produce a detailed investigation report for Ji Tianxing to review. This method could also prevent some domain leaders from having selfish motives and deliberately making false reports, concealing information or falsifying information. Of course, with the restriction of the heavenly oath, they would not dare to do so. Chapter 4369. After Ji Tianxing gave the order, he did not let the 88 territorial lords leave. He then gave another order and summoned the 6 powerhouses into the great conference hall. The 6 experts were of different shapes and sizes, and their strengths were also different. The strongest was a 9th-level divine king, and the weakest was a 6th-level divine king. However, they all had one thing in common, and that was that they had experienced the vicissitudes of life, and all of them had old illnesses or terrible injuries. When the 6 divine kings entered the conference hall, everyone's eyes were focused on them. A few of the territorial lords were very experienced and had seen the 6 divine kings before, so they immediately recognized them. Divine King Fengque? The patriarch of the Feng clan? Divine King Lianhai? Isn't that the patriarch of the Lianhai clan? And Raging Sea Blade? Oh my god. They're still alive? Unbelievable, they have disappeared for 1,000 years. And now they have reappeared. Weren't these 6 divine kings the subordinates of Lord Kenshin? I understand now. Ever since Lord Sword God perished, these few experts were lucky enough to survive, and they all changed their names. The domain masters in the hall recognized the 6 God King experts, and they all cried out in surprise, whispering into each other's ears. The territorial lords who had seen the mysterious experts enter the universe grotto heaven immediately realized that the 6 old Kenshin subordinates were those mysterious experts. Obviously, those mysterious experts were the 6 old Kenshin subordinates in disguise to fool others. Otherwise, how could they have escaped the 9-Yang God Emperor and the 8-Eyed Divine King's search and lived for 1,000 years? Now that they had returned to Kenshin's side, they could finally hold their heads high and reveal their true identities. Other thoughts flashed through the minds of some of the territorial lords. From the injuries of the 6 old Kenshin subordinates, one could see how fierce and cruel the battle of the gods was. The fact that the 6 old Kenshin subordinates could survive and live in disguise for 1,000 years meant that they had endured humiliation and accumulated endless hatred and killing intent. Logically speaking, after returning to Kenshin's side, They should have followed Kenshin into the Outlands to seek revenge on the 5 god emperors. What was Kenshin trying to do by summoning them into the main hall at this time? Could it be that he was going to appoint these 6 subordinates? Many domain lords had guessed this, and most of them felt that it was understandable. After all, Kenshin would definitely leave the Qianquan continent and hand over the entire continent to his trusted subordinates. Looking at the entire hall, all 88 domain lords had just pledged their loyalty to the Kenshin. In comparison, Kenshin's subordinates who had risked their lives for him back then were more worthy of his trust. Especially Divine King Fengque. Even Divine King Sea God King and Raging Sea Mad Blade were 9th and 8th level Divine King realm experts. Moreover, their loyalty to the Kenshin was well known throughout the world. Both Divine King Fengque and Divine King Sea God King were once clan leaders of ancient clans, holding the fates of tens of thousands of disciples in their hands. However, for the sake of their loyalty, they did not hesitate to sacrifice the fate of their entire clan to accompany the Kenshin to the grave. Although the 2 clan leaders were still alive, their clans had long been annihilated. During the War of the Gods, the 2,000 to 3,000 elite disciples they had led had already perished in the great battle. After Kenshin's fall and his army's defeat, the 5 god emperors united the god realm and purged Kenshin's forces. The Feng clan and Divine King Sea God King's clan were undoubtedly wiped clean. The 8-eyed Divine King's pursuit of the 2 clans' disciples lasted for a full 100 years before it ended. As for Raging Sea Mad Blade, he was once the sect leader of the top sect, the Mad Blade sect. He was a famous Blade King in the Qianquan continent. Ever since Raging Sea Mad Blade sparred with Kenshin and lost to Kenshin in a bet, he had loyally followed Kenshin and served Kenshin. During the War of the Gods, Raging Sea Mad Blade had led all the disciples of the Mad Blade sect to join the battle. In the end, the Mad Blade sect's disciples had all perished in the void, their souls scattered. Only Raging Sea Mad Blade, the sect leader, had survived. However, he had changed his name and did not dare to reveal his whereabouts and identity. One could imagine what kind of torment Raging Sea Mad Blade had endured in the past 1,000 years. Understanding this point, the various territorial lords felt that it was reasonable for Kenshin to hand over the Qianquan continent to these experts to manage. As expected, Kenshin's next words confirmed everyone's guesses. Silence. Ji Tianqing raised his hands, causing the entire hall to fall silent. Everyone looked up at him. I announce that from now on Fengque will be appointed as the master of the Qianquan continent. He will manage the Qianquan continent on behalf of me and handle all matters. Even Sea God King will be appointed as the left protector and Raging Sea Mad Blade will be appointed as the right protector. They will assist Fengque in managing the continent and control life and death. Qin Shan will be appointed as the governor of the Imperial Guards. Cheng Feng and Yu Huahua will be the inspector. The short and powerful appointments determine the highest management and decision-making level of the Qianquan continent. Fengque replaced the 8-eyed Divine King as the master of the continent. Even Sea God King and Raging Sea Mad Blade had power second only to Fengque, assisting Fengque in managing the continent. Even the other 3 Divine Kings had great power, suppressing all the territorial lords and sections. Even though these 6 experts were appointed by Kenshin, they were equivalent to airborne rulers and did not have a foundation yet. However, all the territorial lords had sworn loyalty to Kenshin. Now that Kenshin had issued an order, they had no choice but to obey. Towards the 6 new rulers, the 88 territorial lords could only be respectful and obedient. They did not dare to have any thoughts of disloyalty. After Ji Tianqing announced the appointment, everyone in the main hall smiled and congratulated the 6 powerhouses for taking up their positions. However, Fengque and the others' expressions did not show much joy or excitement. They even looked a little helpless. They had no choice. Staying in the Qianquan continent and holding great power was not the result they wanted. If they were allowed to choose, they would rather follow Kenshin and head to the outer realm to seek revenge on the 5 god emperors. However, in the past month the old subordinates of Kenshin returned. There were a total of 14 experts and over 2,000 soldiers. Kenshin did not have any foundation in the Qianquan continent. They could only stay and hand over the Qianquan continent to them. In Kenshin's words, this was a heavy responsibility. It was Kenshin's absolute trust in them. Fengque and the others had repeatedly declined. However, in the end they could not disobey Kenshin's orders. They could only accept the appointment. Of course, Ji Tianqing had already thought it through. After taking over the Qianquan continent, he would unify the entire god world. Next, he was not in a hurry to find the 5 god emperors. He wanted to stay for a while to treat Feng Kuo and the others' injuries. When he was done with the matters in the Qianquan continent and had made sufficient preparations, he would leave the god world. Chapter 4370. A month had passed since Ji Tianqing summoned the 88 territorial lords. All the territorial lords returned to their respective territories and began implementing the new policies. With the abolition of slavery, the people regained their freedom. The entire Qianquan continent was filled with a celebratory atmosphere. The people did not care who ruled the continent. They only cared about who could bring them freedom and peace. The people had no feelings towards the territorial lords and the kings of the god kingdoms. However, the people were extremely grateful to the Kenshin who ruled the continent. They sang praises and praised him generously. Like the people of the other continents, the people of the Qianquan continent took the initiative to tear down the old shrines and destroyed the statues of the 8-eyed god king and the 9-sun god emperor. They spontaneously built shrines, consecrated the statue of the sword god and worshipped him devoutly. Ji Tianqing did not use the power of faith to gather power like the 5 god emperors and the overlords of the continents. However, the people of the 5 continents of the god realm all built statues and worshipped him. The invisible and huge telekinesis was transformed by the heavenly Tao into a powerful divine power of faith that constantly supported him. This was also one of the reasons why his strength continued to increase rapidly in the process of conquering the god realm. A month later, the 40 or so territorial lords who had received the order to report the results of the investigation also completed their respective tasks. Each of the territorial lords sent a message to Ji Tianqing and reported the results of their investigation in detail. Ji Tianqing seriously read through all the reports. Through comparison and analysis, he had an answer in his heart and finally made a decision. 2 days later, he issued an order to the Qianquan continent to appoint 12 godly king experts as the new territorial lords. The 12 godly king experts were the top experts of their respective regions. Not only were they powerful, but they also had a certain foundation of power. Most importantly, the nature and character of these godly kings were trustworthy. They were respected by many experts, forces, and people. Their ability to execute, efficiency, and methods were also guaranteed. Ji Tianqing did not personally go to the 12 regions and only issued an order to the world. However, his orders were supreme and unquestionable. The 12 God King experts were filled with excitement as they received the order to be promoted to Domain Lord and swore their loyalty to Ji Tianqing through the air. Even though the other forces and experts of the various regions were unwilling and full of regret, they could only accept their fate. They didn't dare to disobey Kenshin's orders, so naturally, they couldn't do anything to harm the 12 area leaders. As for the commoners of the 12 districts, as long as the person was appointed by the Kenshin, they would recognize him or her. Just like this, the situation in the 100 regions of the Qianquan continent stabilized. Following the implementation of the new policies by the territorial lords, a series of changes were carried out. It would probably take another 8 to 10 years for the new policies to be completely completed. At that time, the Qianquan continent would truly calm down. In addition, during this month, God King Feng Kuo, God King Lian Hai, and the others quickly adapted to their positions in various affairs. Even if Ji Tianqing were to leave now, they would still be able to control the Qianquan continent and carry out their orders accurately. God King Feng Kuo and the others weren't willing to stay behind to control the Qianquan continent and would rather follow Ji Tianqing to take revenge. However, since they stayed behind, they would definitely do their job well and manage the Qianquan continent in an orderly manner. They wouldn't let down Ji Tianqing's trust. The various changes in the Qianquan continent were still in progress. Ji Tianqing was very relaxed as he stayed in the Qianquan grotto heaven, patiently observing and waiting. Other than the necessary meetings and discussions, he had always been in the secret chamber, staying in the distorted space-time of the God Pagoda in seclusion. It was necessary to continue increasing his strength. After all, he had already unified the God world. After the God world was completely stabilized, he would lead many experts and an army into the outer realm. That would also be on the agenda. Soon he would have to face the 5 God emperors in person. However, until now he was still a God king. Even if he was a super God king that had never been seen before, 60 times stronger than an ordinary peak God king. However, he still hadn't taken the final step and was still limited to the God King realm. Even if his strength had increased greatly in the past 10 years and his strength had increased by leaps and bounds, there were no signs of a breakthrough. He was basically certain that only when his strength was strengthened to the limit and reached 99 times that of a peak God King, could he break through the God Emperor realm. However, he couldn't wait any longer. He didn't know when he would reach the limit. Therefore, he had been comprehending the heaven-punishing formation, working hard to condense heavenly energy and Daoist rhymes. This matter was unjust and sullen. Other peak God Kings could condense a trace of Daoist rhymes. However, he, a peak God King, was dozens of times stronger than other peak God Kings, yet he couldn't condense Daoist rhymes. When other God Kings did something to save the world, they would obtain the power of merit bestowed by the heavenly Tao. Yet he did not. How could he reason with this? Say that the heavenly energy was unfair and treated him differently? This wasn't right. He had an invisible connection with the heavenly energy. The heavenly energy could give him enlightenment, and he could also use the heavenly energy to make a heavenly oath. Even the billions of people in the realm of gods believed that he was the embodiment of justice, the son of the heavenly energy. Since the heavenly energy was so close to him, why couldn't he condense Daoist rhymes? Zhou couldn't figure it out for now. He could only try his best to comprehend the formation and condense Daoist rhymes. Recently he did gain something. With the help of the vast and invisible heavenly energy, he gradually condensed a trace of Daoist rhymes. Finally seeing the hope of success, Zhou was encouraged. He couldn't give up halfway. Therefore he temporarily put aside the plan of recruiting experts and leaving the realm of gods. He stayed in the heaven and earth grotto heaven, staying in the distorted spacetime and trying his best to condense Daoist rhymes. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, another 6 months had passed. In this half a year, the situation in the realm of gods had calmed down, and the situation in the heaven and earth continent had stabilized. Zhou various new policies were implemented in hundreds of regions. They were gradually being refined into empires and kingdoms of gods. The people were still cheering and their gratitude towards Zhou didn't decrease. Shrines and statues of Kenshin were built in every city and village. Every day there was an endless stream of people worshipping them. As for the people in the other 4 continents, they were still the same as before. They worshipped and thanked Kenshin as a daily routine. Perhaps it was because the power of faith gathered by the billions of people in the realm of gods was too strong. It made it much easier for Zhou to condense Daoist rhymes. Half a year had passed in the outside world, and he had been in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for 25 years. Finally, he successfully condensed a trace of Daoist rhymes. The mysterious and indescribable 5-colored Daoist rhymes contained many powerful and wonderful powers. Just a trace of Daoist rhymes contained the scene of new life, prosperity, and destruction. It was like a world. Zhou thought about it and named it the Disillusionment Daoist rhymes. Chapter 4371. The so-called Dao rhyme was actually the experience and comprehension of every peak god king of the divine Dao they had cultivated throughout their life. Every peak god king could master as many as 600 to 700 types of divine Dao laws. In other words, these peak god kings could master most of the world's powers and laws. However, every peak god king's focus was different and the attributes of the divine power they were proficient in were also different. The Dao rhyme that they condensed usually contained many types of powers and laws that they were most proficient in. Those experiences and comprehension resonated with the heavenly Dao and condensed into Dao rhyme. It could be said that Dao rhyme was the fruit and crystallization of a peak god king's lifetime cultivation of divine Dao. It was also the fusion of experience and comprehension. Zhou disillusioned Dao rhyme was very special. It was not like other peak god kings whose Dao rhyme manifested powers and laws that were mainly based on the 5 elements: wind, fire, lightning, etc. Instead, it was an indescribable yet majestic scene and comprehension. Dao rhyme was no longer limited to the powers and laws of the world. Instead, it was the understanding, thinking, and conclusion of everything in the world. It included the thinking of the world, stars, void, the origin, growth, and destruction of the universe. This was a secret that countless peak god kings could not touch and could not solve. Naturally, it could not be fused into Dao rhyme. The reason why Zhou named it Disillusion Dao rhyme was because the Dao rhyme that he condensed was mostly the scene of desolation, destruction, and decline. It could not be helped. This was related to his experience. It was a part of his life's experience and comprehension. But no matter what, it was a huge improvement for him to successfully condense Dao Rhyme. After condensing Dao Rhyme, he could clearly feel that his powers and more than 1,000 types of laws had a qualitative leap. Now he had more confidence in facing the 5 God Emperors. After ending his seclusion, Ji Tianqing left the distorted spacetime and returned to the secret room in Universe Grotto Heaven. He summoned God King Feng Kuo, God King Lian Hai and the rest to ask about the situation in Universe Continent for the past half a year. After knowing that everything was normal in Universe Continent and that the new policies were being implemented step by step and the situation was stabilizing, he was relieved. Next he gave a few more instructions to the God Kings, and expressed that he would be leaving the God Realm soon. After all, he had unified God World and the situation was stable. His own strength had reached a level where he could fight against the God Emperor, so of course he wouldn't continue to stay in the God Realm. However, before he left the Divine World, he still needed to recruit more God King experts to follow him to the void outside the Divine World. Although he already had over 50 Divine King experts and over 5,000 Divine Lord experts under his command. However, it was far from enough to clash with the 5 God Emperors. From the information Ji Tianqing had gathered, he could basically confirm that the 5 God Emperors had at least 100 God Kings and tens of thousands of Divine Lord soldiers in outer space. Moreover, they had also plundered trillions of cultivation resources. Even if they spent another 2,000 or 3,000 years, they would not run out of resources. Ji Tianqing needed to be more prepared before he could seek out the 5 God Emperors. After all, he had failed once all those years ago. He absolutely couldn't fail again this time. When God King Feng Kuo, God King Lian Hai and the others heard this, their eyes immediately lit up. They volunteered to follow. Ji Tianqing rolled his eyes at them but didn't say anything. However, the few God Kings were stunned for a moment before they understood what he meant. They smiled awkwardly. Clearly, if Ji Tianqing wanted to recruit experts to follow him, he would have to choose from the experts of the 5 continents. God King Feng Kuo, God King Lian Hai, and the others had already been appointed as the administrators of Qinkuan continent. Naturally, they couldn't leave. Otherwise, all the previous efforts and arrangements would go to waste. More importantly, the God world must be firmly under his control. This way, even if Ji Tianqing fought with the 5 God Emperors in case he lost, he could still return to the God world to recuperate. The God world was Ji Tianqing's base camp and solid backing. There must not be any mishaps. Understanding this point, the few God Kings bowed respectfully, indicating that they would immediately send out orders to recruit ambitious people. After waiting for the few God Kings, Ji Tianqing took out a communication jade slip and sent out orders to the rulers of the other 4 continents. Nangong Buhua, who was in charge of Boundless Heaven Continent, Song Hetao, who was in charge of Reincarnation Island, Illusory Sun Sect Master, who was in charge of Firmament Continent, Tang Yi, Leijin Song, Leijin Xiong, and the others who were in charge of Primal Chaos Continent. After receiving Ji Tianqing's orders, they immediately sent back communication jade slips, indicating that they could handle this matter. Just like this, the news that Kenshin wanted to recruit ambitious people to leave the God world and head to the void outside spread across the 5 continents. In just a few days, Kenshin's orders reached every God kingdom in the 5 continents. When the trillions of people heard about this, there was a lot of discussion. Logically speaking, Ji Tianqing was already the ruler of the God world. The 5 continents of the God world, tens of thousands of God kingdoms, and trillions of people were all under his jurisdiction. They were all the people of his territory. If he wanted to lead a large number of God kings and a massive army to the void outside to seek revenge on the 5 God emperors, he only needed to give the order. As long as he ordered the experts and soldiers to be recruited, there should be no one who would dare to disobey. However, the problem was that Ji Tianqing was well aware that if he ordered the recruitment of soldiers, most of them would be forced to obey. They would definitely not be willing to do so. These soldiers who were unwilling and even resentful would definitely not be able to display much fighting strength, and it would be difficult to guarantee their loyalty. Most importantly, if he did so, he would destroy Kenshin's reputation as well as his titles as the embodiment of justice and the child of the heavenly Tao. For the sake of his own personal grudge, he would force countless soldiers to work for him. What was the difference between him and the cruel and tyrannical 5 God emperors? Returning freedom and peace to the people would also become empty talk and a joke. Therefore, Ji Tianqing decided to open the recruitment and let the experts of the God world choose for themselves. He naturally welcomed experts who were willing to follow him to battle in the void. Those who were unwilling to sign up and did not want to risk their lives in battle, he would not force them either. Facts had proven that Ji Tianxing's way of doing things had won the hearts of the people, causing all the people of the God world to feel admiration for him. Even though the people of the God world worshipped him and wanted to follow him to battle in the void. However, the ordinary people of the God world did not have the right to follow him. Only upper divine lords and God King experts could follow him and form an army to battle. However, after all the upper divine lords and God King experts received the order, they all fell into silence, hesitating and weighing the pros and cons. The result was just as Ji Tianxing had expected. Even though there were at least 5,000 to 6,000 God Kings and hundreds of thousands of upper divine lords on the 5 continents of the God world. However, after an entire month, the number of people who were willing to follow Ji Tianxing to battle in the void was few and far between. Ji Tianxing was not in a hurry. He continued to cultivate in seclusion, secretly gathering and organizing cultivation resources, and methodically making preparations. Chapter 4372. After the public recruitment, Ji Tianxing waited in the Heaven and Earth Grotto Heaven for another half a year. At this time, Jiku Yunyao and the others who were in seclusion in the distorted spacetime had recovered. Even Nangong Nihuang Zhenhong Lin Shui and the others had recovered to their peak condition. Only Nangong Ao and a dozen followers were in seclusion in the God-slaying battleship. Their injuries had not fully recovered yet. In addition, Feng Kuo Lianhai and the other 5 God Kings were recovering quickly and steadily with Ji Tianxing's help. The 5 continents of the God world were peaceful now. Even if Ji Tianxing left the God world, he could rest assured. It was a pity that the number of soldiers who responded to the recruitment and came to the Heaven and Earth continent to follow him was less than 10,000. Outside the Heaven and Earth Grotto Heaven, there were only about 9,000 soldiers gathered. Among them there were more than 200 God Kings and the rest were God Monarchs. Of course, 95% of them were upper God Kings and only a small number were middle God Monarchs. Although the 9,000 soldiers looked majestic and there were more than 200 God Kings among them, it was still considered a large number of experts. However, compared to the thousands of God Kings and close to 1 million God Monarchs in the God world, this number was really too little. Ji Tianxing was not surprised by this result and did not feel disappointed. After all, if they followed him into battle, they would have to leave their homes, leave the God realm and go through life and death battles. Even if he unified the entire God world, the 5 God Emperors had accumulated power for thousands of years. The people's reverence for the 5 God Emperors was deeply rooted. Everyone knew that after Kenshin unified the God world, he would definitely go to the outer realm to seek revenge on the 5 God Emperors. The soldiers who were able to follow him to the void outside the region and fight against the 5 great God Emperors had all made an extremely great determination. Through Ji Tianxing's investigation, he found that many of the 9,000 soldiers had a common point. They were dissatisfied and resentful of the 5 God Emperors. All of them had different experiences, and all of them had direct or indirect conflicts and hatred with the 5 God Emperors. In the past, when the 5 God Emperors ruled the God realm, it could be said that the entire God realm was shrouded in darkness. These godly kings and godly monarchs who had been bullied, exploited, tortured and persecuted had nowhere to seek redress, let alone take revenge. In order to protect themselves from being wiped out by the forces under the 5 God Emperors, they could only choose to conceal their identities and suppress their hatred in the depths of their hearts. Fortunately, Kenshin had returned to the divine realm and overthrown the 5 God Emperors' rule, taking control of the divine realm. Only then did they see hope for revenge. It was revenge that gave them the motivation to follow Kenshin. Ji Tianxing was quite satisfied with this. Strictly speaking, most of the 9,000 soldiers shared the same goal as him. Only such soldiers would be easier to control. Only then would they be able to arouse the morale of the soldiers and display a stronger combat strength. He had always believed that quality was more important than quantity. Throughout his return to the divine realm and his conquest of the 5 continents, he had never led an army of tens of thousands in a direct confrontation with an enemy. Most of the time he had acted alone or brought only a small number of elite soldiers, and this had produced miraculous results. 5 days later, Ji Tianxing received the 9,000 soldiers who had come to pledge their loyalty and follow him in the plaza of the Universe Grotto Heaven. As usual, he waved his hand and sent out a white light to display the contents of the heavenly Dao Oath. allowing the 9,000 soldiers to swear their loyalty on the spot. Only soldiers who had sworn their loyalty were worthy of complete trust and were entrusted with important tasks. Following this, Ji Tianxing organized the 9,000 soldiers into ranks and confirmed their commanders, generals, captains, and other positions. After confirming the various positions and letting the soldiers get used to each other for a few days, he bid farewell to God King Fengque and the others and left the universe grotto heaven. Thinking back when he had returned to the God realm, he only had a dozen or so family and friends under his command. Now that he had left the God realm, he had gathered 15,000 soldiers under his command, including more than 250 God kings. This was despite the fact that the number of soldiers under the command of any God emperor far exceeded the number of soldiers in his army. However, Ji Tianxing was not worried in the slightest. He was even more confident in facing the 5 God emperors. When the sun rose, Ji Tianxing led the many soldiers onto the God-slaying battleship. Under the respectful escort of God King Fengque and the others, they left the universe grotto heaven. The God-slaying battleship soared in the sky and soon broke through the dome of heaven, entering the starry sky outside the realm. The 15,000 soldiers were all settled in the God-slaying battleship by Ji Tianxing. Originally, he could have settled them in the world within the primordial chaos bell. Unfortunately, the primordial chaos bell had been severely damaged during the battle with the Prajna God Emperor's incarnation and had yet to recover. The world within the bell was still in a shattered state and had yet to be repaired. Naturally, it was unable to settle the many soldiers. Fortunately, the God-slaying battleship was a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact. Even though it looked like it was only 10,000 feet long, its interior was like a world of its own. More than 10,000 soldiers were separated into 30 secret rooms. Each room could hold 500 people. Ji Tianxing distributed a large amount of cultivation resources to each soldier and let them stay in the God-slaying battleship and cultivate in peace. Only when there was a need for them would he issue an order to inform them. Many soldiers thought that after Kenshin left the God world, he would definitely head to the depths of the void to seek revenge on the 5 God emperors. But in reality, how could Ji Tianxing be so careless? Subduing and unifying the entire God world was just a matter of convenience when he was roaming the starry sky outside the realm. He had not forgotten that his mission was still not complete. He still had not found any clues about his master, the Heavenly Dragon Emperor. He still had to continue investigating. After the God-slaying battleship left the God world, it flew into the depths of the void at lightning speed. It was headed for the Sky Crane Galaxy. There were 9 galaxies in the void outside the realm. Ji Tianxing had already explored and investigated 6 of them. He had not gone to the Sky Crane Galaxy, the Sky Phoenix Galaxy, and the Sky Unicorn Galaxy. Before he returned to the God world, he already had a premonition that there was no hope for him to find any clues about his master's death. But he was not willing to give up so easily. He still decided to continue investigating the last 3 galaxies. The God world was not far from the Sky Crane Galaxy. With the speed of the God-slaying battleship, it would take about 3 months to reach. Before entering the Sky Crane Galaxy, Ji Tianxing knew in advance that the actual ruler of the Sky Crane Galaxy, the current ruler of the galaxy, was actually the disciple of the Azura God Emperor. Of course, rather than calling him a disciple, it was more appropriate to call him a puppet. The domain ruler obeyed the orders of the Azura God Emperor completely. He had a firm grip on the Sky Crane Galaxy and wantonly plundered cultivation resources. The reason why the 5 God Emperors could continuously explore the mysteries of the Grey Fog and never lack cultivation resources was because of the continuous plundering of cultivation resources by the experts under their command. The domain ruler of the Sky Crane Galaxy was just an ordinary peak god king who had pulled up the seedlings to help them grow. He posed no threat to Ji Tianxing. Not to mention now, even before he returned to the God world, Ji Tianxing could easily get rid of him. Chapter 4373. Ji Tianxing was still on the God-slaying battleship heading toward the Sky Crane Galaxy at a leisurely pace. On the one hand, it allowed the soldiers to rest and reorganize. On the other hand, it gave him more time to prepare and improve his strength. Meanwhile, near the Grey Fog in the depths of the void, the 5 God Emperors could no longer sit still. Even though the 5 great God Emperors were leading tens of thousands of soldiers to guard different directions of the Grey Fog and they were separated by hundreds of millions of kilometers from each other, they were still very far away from each other. But they were communicating through transmission and discussing something. That damned Long Tian, he still managed to conquer the entire God realm. Ever since he conquered the boundless heaven continent 2 years ago, I've already predicted this outcome. Damn it. I only hate that my original body can't return to the God realm and personally kill that bastard Xianxia. Calm down. Compared to what we're doing now, what's that little territory in the God realm? Sigh. But Xianxia unified the God realm and stole our territory. In the end, we've been thoroughly humiliated. That's right. Our disciples and right-hand men were beaten up by Xianxia until they fled like stray dogs. This is a great humiliation. This battle is too humiliating. No matter what, we have to regain our dignity. Xianxia was defeated by us and we've already killed him once. How can we let him run wild again? The God Emperors all felt that Xianxia's effortless unification of the entire God realm was a slap to their faces. It made them feel exceptionally aggrieved. There was no helping it. Their clones couldn't defeat Xianxia, and their original bodies couldn't leave the gray fog. They could only watch as Xianxia swaggered around. How could they not feel aggrieved? While the God Emperors grumbled and complained, Prajna God Emperor remained silent and didn't express her opinion. This wasn't just because she was the only woman among the 5 God Emperors, but also because of the inexplicable past between her and Xianxia. Of course, after her clone fought against the Xianxia and was forced to self-destruct, those feelings had completely faded. The other 4 God Emperors saw that Hanya didn't say anything, so they sent messages to ask, Hanya, Xianxia was so arrogant and despotic and even forced your avatar to self-destruct. Aren't you angry? Hanya, let bygones be bygones. You are already a God Emperor. You should set your sights further. Compared to what we're doing now and the power we're about to wield, what is the Xianxia? You're just an ant. Hanya, what do you think? The gazes of the 4 God Emperors all gathered on Hanya's body. It was impossible for her not to speak even if she wanted to. In the face of the 4 God Emperors' inquiries, she could only voice her own thoughts and give the most reasonable suggestions. Senior brothers, the Xianxia that has been reborn is much stronger than before. This is an indisputable fact. Let's not look into how he was reborn. Let's just talk about the current situation. Given his strength and methods, none of our avatars can defeat him. In fact, based on my understanding of Xianxia, even if our true bodies were to fight him alone, there's a risk of defeat. The 4 God Emperors all had the same answer to this point and expressed their agreement. It was just that they would never admit this out loud. In fact, the Nebula God Emperor and the Ninyang God Emperor even symbolically retorted, expressing their disdain for Xianxia. Hanya, you're overestimating Xianxia too much. No matter how strong Xianxia is, he's still just a God King. As long as he doesn't break through to God Emperor realm, he won't be able to defeat us. This is the difference between realms. Hanya couldn't be bothered to explain or refute the 2 God Emperors' arguments. She continued, our avatars can't defeat Xianxia and our true bodies can't leave. Thus, it's reasonable that Xianxia would unite the entire God realm. However, as you've all said, we've already plundered enough cultivation resources and don't need to rely on the God realm's supply. Compared to the God realm's territory and our reputation, the matter at hand is obviously more important. As long as we successfully decipher the secrets of this star of chaos, we'll be able to control the strongest power in the world, surpassing all others and obtaining eternal life. At that time, the entire universe will be ours. Why should we care about a mere God realm? The 4 God Emperors remained silent, expressing their agreement with Hanya's point of view. Hanya paused for a moment, then continued, now that the situation has developed to this point, we don't need to do anything. We just need to wait. We've killed Xianxia once and he has a deep grudge against us. He'll definitely come for revenge. This is one of the reasons. Secondly, we've been searching for the whereabouts of the heaven-punishing formation for the past 1,000 years, but we've never found it. From Xianxia's monstrous performance, it's very likely that the heaven-punishing formation is with him. The eternal heavenly scripture we have is the first half, the key to entering the God Emperor realm. The heaven-punishing formation is the second half. If Xianxia wants to defeat us, he'll have to break through to the God Emperor realm. If he wants to break through to the God Emperor realm, he'll have to find us and try to seize the eternal heavenly scripture. Thus, based on these 2 conditions, I can conclude that Xianxia will take the initiative to come find us. What we need to do is to gather our strength and defense and wait for Xianxia to walk into the trap. As long as we keep in contact and cooperate with each other, once Kenshin attacks and we can't deal with him alone, we'll work together to deal with him. When Hanya reached this point, she'd basically said everything she wanted to say. It was just that these words were too straightforward, making people feel uncomfortable listening to them. The Nine God Emperor and the Nebula God Emperor immediately retorted, expressing their disdain. As long as Kenshin dares to come here, this emperor can easily deal with him alone. Even if this emperor can't kill him alone, this emperor still has tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of god kings under my command. Wouldn't it be easy to kill him? Hanya, you're exaggerating again. Why do we need to work together to deal with Kenshin? Hanya naturally understood that these two slightly younger god emperors were only retorting to save face and dignity. Their words were actually words that went against their hearts. Like the Shura god emperor and the god emperor of the underworld, these two old and cunning god emperors wouldn't speak rashly. Just as expected. After Hanya finished speaking, the several god emperors were silent for a long time. Only then did the god emperor of the underworld and the Shura god emperor express their opinions and conclude the matter. Hanya's words are very reasonable. This emperor thinks that we should do it this way. Now that our forces have been cut off, it's very difficult to find out the real-time situation in the heavenly realm. Since that's the case, then we should prepare ourselves and wait for Kenshin to walk into the trap. Since the two god emperors of the underworld and Shura had spoken, it could be said that this matter had come to an end. Following this, the five god emperors no longer discussed this matter. They all mobilized their forces, strengthened their defenses, and waited for Kenshin to attack. Chapter 4374. 3 months later, the god-slaying battleship entered the Sky Crane Galaxy. In the vast galaxy, there were hundreds of millions of stars that were densely packed and suspended in the void. There were more than 1,000 stars that were protected by colorful divine light barriers, and countless living beings lived in them. The other stars were basically lifeless and cold. However, there were many higher-grade stars that contained large amounts of metals and cultivation resources. Ji Tianxing wandered around the Sky Crane Galaxy. He would only stop to devour and refine the higher-grade stars that contained rich resources when he saw them. There were many ways for him to improve his strength. Devouring stars was just one of them. Of course, it was also a fast and effective way to improve his strength. Other than devouring and refining the higher-grade stars, Ji Tianxing spent the rest of his time exploring the various stars to find clues related to his master, the Heavenly Dragon Emperor. The more than 1,000 stars with life were protected by the divine light barriers, and many guards under the Star Lord's command were patrolling and guarding. However, these defenses were useless to Ji Tianxing. He could enter and exit any star silently. After he was done with his investigation, he could leave quietly. Even though no one had noticed him while he was investigating the various stars. However, after 10 years he still could not find any clues about the Heavenly Dragon Emperor after he had investigated more than 1,000 stars. From all the information and clues, the Heavenly Dragon Emperor did not stay here in the past. He did not even come here before. Hence, Ji Tianxing went to the center of power in the Sky Crane Galaxy, the Sky Crane Star. The Sky Crane Star was the largest and highest-grade Big Dipper star in the entire galaxy. It was covered by a thick layer of colorful divine light. There were 7 continents on this star, close to 1,000 divine kingdoms, and close to 1 trillion living beings of various races. The Star Lord who controlled this star was also the Star Lord of the entire galaxy. Ji Tianxing had already investigated clearly. The Sky Crane Territorial Lord was the disciple of the god of the underworld. He had become a disciple of the god of the underworld 10,000 years ago and was promoted to the peak divine king 1,000 years ago. On the surface, it seemed like Territory Lord Tian he had an outstanding aptitude and had successfully broken through to the peak divine king realm under the guidance of the god of the underworld. However, in reality, it was basically impossible for Region Lord Tian he to become a peak divine king with his talent and aptitude. It was the god of the underworld who had forcefully promoted Domain Lord Tian he to a peak divine king. After all, the Sky Crane Territory Master was one of his most trusted and valued disciples. He had to help him rule the Sky Crane Territory. Only by becoming a peak divine king would he have enough deterrence to firmly control the Sky Crane Galaxy. Even though both master and disciple were well aware that Domain Lord Tian he's peak divine king realm was greatly exaggerated. In terms of true strength he was completely inferior to peak divine kings who broke through on their own. But in this world the number of peak divine kings was scarce. It was absolutely not that easy to break through. It was enough to help Domain Lord Sky Crane reach the peak divine king realm and suppress the Sky Crane galaxy. Even if this would affect the foundation of Domain Lord Sky Crane's divine path and prevent him from improving in the future, it would be even more impossible for him to break through to the God Emperor realm. However, Domain Lord Sky Crane's aptitude was limited. He had not even reached the peak divine king realm and naturally could not improve further. After Ji Tianxing entered the Sky Crane galaxy, he went straight to the divine crane continent. He had already recovered the divine world and occupied the lairs of the 5 god emperors. Naturally, he would not let go of the other forces under the 5 god emperor realm. For example, if Ji Tianxing did not occupy the Sky Crane galaxy and kill Domain Lord Sky Crane, Domain Lord Sky Crane would continue to provide cultivation resources to the god of the underworld. In the middle of the divine crane continent, there was a vast forest with a radius of millions of miles. There were mountains that were tens of thousands of feet high. They were continuous and crisscrossed. Endless towering trees covered the entire mountain range, containing abundant spiritual qi and resources of heaven and earth. This mountain range was known as the highest point of the entire continent. It was also the source of the continent's spirit veins. Countless mountain ranges extended from here. In the center of the mountain range, there was a mountain range that was tens of thousands of feet high. It was the highest point of the continent. At the highest point of this mountain range, there was a platform with a radius of hundreds of miles. Countless palaces, mansions and pavilions were built on it. This was the residence of Domain Lord Sky Crane, the famous Divine Crane Palace. At this time the Divine Crane Palace was as calm and solemn as usual. Thousands of divine sovereign guards were firmly guarding the inside and outside of the palace, guarding the various passageways and door cards. Countless servants and maids served the nobles in the various palaces and mansions. Many experts and generals were also cultivating in their respective residences or handling official business. Although everything seemed calm in reality, Domain Lord Tianhe's heart was unable to calm down. As early as 2 years ago, he had received news that Kenshin had caused a storm of blood in the divine world and subdued the boundless heaven continent and reincarnation island. In addition, the god of the underworld's avatar had also fought with Kenshin in outer space and was destroyed by Kenshin. For the next 2 years, Domain Lord Sky Crane had been paying attention to the situation in the divine world. Although he was very far away from the divine world and received news late. Now he also knew that Kenshin had conquered the entire divine world. In recent months, Domain Lord Sky Crane had been thinking about a question. Kenshin had conquered the divine world to destroy the lairs of the 5 god emperors and consolidate his power. What would happen after Kenshin conquered the divine world? Where would he go and what would he do? Many people in the divine world thought that Kenshin would go to the depths of the void to seek revenge on the 5 god emperors. But Domain Lord Sky Crane did not think so. He had studied Kenshin's previous experiences and actions and found that before Kenshin returned to the divine world, he had traveled to several galaxies. What did this mean? It meant that Kenshin wanted to travel to various galaxies and would stay in each galaxy for a few years, as if he was looking for something. But after Kenshin left the Heavenly Strategy Galaxy, which was very close to the divine world, he returned and unified the entire divine world. Now that Kenshin had left the divine world, he would definitely not return. He would most likely continue to explore the other 3 galaxies. In this way, the Sky Crane Galaxy, which was the closest to the divine world, would bear the brunt. After many deductions and guesses, Domain Lord Sky Crane became more and more convinced of this answer. He also felt that danger was approaching. He was very worried and a little panicked. Now that Kenshin was invincible, apart from the 5 god emperors, no one could contend against him. Even if Domain Lord Sky Crane could gather 100,000 elite soldiers under his command, he did not have the courage or confidence to fight against Kenshin. He had been hesitating whether to defend the Sky Crane Galaxy or lead his soldiers and escape. In a situation where he could not make up his mind, he could only ask the god of the underworld for instructions. The god of the underworld was also hesitant and conflicted. He could not make up his mind.